There is a question that nobody in the history books seems to want to answer directly. Britain, a small island on the northwestern edge of Europe, has more ancient ruins per square mile than any other country on the continent. More than Greece, more than Italy, more than Egypt's European neighbours, more than France, Germany, Spain, or any of the nations we typically associate with ancient grandeur. And the official explanation, the one you find in textbooks and museum placards, feels oddly thin when you actually sit with it. Stone circles, burial mounds, hill forts, earthworks that stretch for miles, structures so enormous that moving them would challenge modern engineers. All of it concentrated on one island, all of it pointing to something that historians have quietly agreed not to ask too loudly. Why here? Why so many? Why so old? And more unsettling than any of those questions, why did so much of it survive when the civilizations that built it simply vanished? If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is something deeply calming about letting ancient mysteries wash over you in the dark, about lying in the warmth of wherever you are right now, while your mind drifts back 10,000 years to a people who left no written record, no clear name, no autobiography, only stone, only earth, only silence. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The ruins are not the mystery, the ruins are the clue. What you are about to hear is not what your history teacher told you. It is not the tidy narrative about Iron Age Celts and Roman invasions and Neolithic farmers wandering in from continental Europe. That story is real, but it is incomplete in ways that become more troubling the longer you look at it. The real story of why Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe involves something darker, something that required enormous investment and enormous loss, something that suggests the people who built these structures were not primitive farmers scratching at the soil between hunts. They were organized, they were driven, they were responding to something, and whatever that something was, it left scars on the landscape so deep that 40 centuries of weather and war and human settlement have not managed to erase them. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers themselves are strange. Britain has an estimated 30,000 ancient sites. 30,000. That number comes from Historic England, the official government body responsible for tracking such things, and even they admit it is probably an undercount because aerial surveys keep finding new ones beneath farmland and forest every year. Crop marks appear during droughts, revealing circular ditches and rectangular enclosures that have been invisible to ground-level observers for centuries. LiDAR scanning, which uses laser pulses to map terrain beneath vegetation, has, in recent years, revealed entire complexes of earthworks that nobody knew existed. The number keeps going up. It never seems to go down. For comparison, France has roughly 15,000 registered prehistoric sites. Spain has around 12,000. Germany, a much larger landmass, has fewer than 10,000. Scandinavia, which shares much of Britain's climate and geographic profile, has perhaps 8,000 across all 5 countries combined. Greece, which we think of as the cradle of Western civilization, a place where ancient ruins are practically a national symbol, has around 5,000 significant prehistoric structures. Britain has 6 times as many as Greece. That is not a minor statistical quirk. That is a signal. Something happened on this island, repeatedly, across thousands of years, that did not happen anywhere else in Europe with the same intensity. Something drove people to move unthinkable quantities of stone and earth. Something organized them into projects that would have required the labor of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of workers for decades at a time. Something made them keep doing it. Generation after generation, site after site, millennium after millennium. And whatever that something was, the official history has never fully explained it. Start with Stonehenge, because everyone starts with Stonehenge. Not because it is the most impressive structure in Britain, which it is not, but because it is the most famous, and because familiarity has made us complacent about how strange it actually is. The stones at Stonehenge weigh between 25 and 50 tons each. The largest, the altar stone, weighs approximately 6 tons. The heel stone, which stands apart from the main circle and aligns with the midsummer sunrise, weighs around 35 tons. These are not pebbles. Moving them with ropes and rollers and human muscle over distances of up to 250 miles in the case of the bluestones, which came from the Presley Hills in Wales, is a logistical operation that modern engineers have spent decades trying to fully understand. Their conclusion, every time, is that it was possible, but barely, and only with a level of social organization that we do not typically associate with Neolithic societies. But here is the thing about Stonehenge that nobody tells you in the tourist brochure. It is not unique. It is not even the biggest stone circle in Britain. The Avebury Monument, 12 miles north of Stonehenge, consists of a massive circular ditch and bank enclosure containing 3 stone circles, the outermost of which has a circumference of over a mile. The henge at Avebury is so large that an entire village has been built inside it. People live within the boundaries of a 5,000-year-old ritual enclosure, so normalized to it that it barely registers as remarkable. The stones at Avebury include some that weigh over 60 tons. The Swindon stone, one of the largest survivors, is estimated at 65 tons. And unlike Stonehenge, Avebury was not built in isolation. It sits at the center of a landscape so dense with prehistoric monuments that archaeologists have a special term for it. They call it a sacred landscape, a zone where the monuments are not individual structures, but components of a single, enormous complex that was planned, modified, and expanded over thousands of years. The Avebury Sacred Landscape includes the West Kennet Long Barrow, one of the largest Neolithic burial mounds in Britain, large enough to walk through standing upright. It includes Salisbury Hill, the largest artificial mound in Europe, a structure that contains no burial, serves no obvious practical purpose, and took an estimated 18 million man-hours to construct. It includes the Beckhampton Avenue and the West Kennet Avenue, processional ways lined with standing stones that once stretched for miles across the landscape. It includes Windmill Hill, one of the earliest causewayed enclosures in Britain, where evidence suggests people gathered from across a wide region for ceremonies that may have lasted weeks. All of this within a few miles of each other, all of it within a few miles of Stonehenge, and this is just one corner of Wiltshire. Expand the lens slightly and you find the Marlborough Downs covered with ancient earthworks. Go north into Lincolnshire and Yorkshire and you find the Yorkshire wolds riddled with round barrows. Go south into Cornwall and you find the Penwith Peninsula, which has the highest density of prehistoric monuments in Britain, an area so small you can drive across it in 20 minutes, containing stone circles, standing stones, ancient burial chambers, cliff castles, and field systems that predate the Roman occupation by 3,000 years. Go to Orkney, the islands off the northern tip of Scotland, and you find what some archaeologists now believe was the center of a Neolithic civilization that may have influenced the construction of monuments across the entire British Isles, including Stonehenge itself. The Ring of Brodgar on Orkney, the stones of Stennes, the Maeshowe chambered cairn, which on the winter solstice is illuminated by a shaft of sunlight that travels through a narrow passage and strikes the back wall of the chamber with geometric precision. The Ness of Brodgar, an excavation site that has revealed what appears to be a massive ceremonial complex, a temple district of enormous structures that were in continuous use for at least 500 years, and which, when it was finally decommissioned, was deliberately buried under a layer of cattle and sheep bones in what appears to have been a final ceremonial feast of extraordinary scale. Something was happening on this island, something organized, something sustained, something that was not happening anywhere else in Europe with the same intensity or the same duration. The question is what? The conventional answer is religion. The monuments were ritual spaces, burial sites, astronomical observatories, gathering places for ceremony. This is almost certainly true. It does not answer the question. It just describes the what and sidesteps the why. Why here? Why this density? Why this persistence? To understand that, you have to go back further than Stonehenge. You have to go back to the beginning of the human story on these islands, and you have to understand that the story is older and stranger and more complicated than the history we were taught. The oldest human remains found in Britain date to around 900,000 years ago. These are not modern humans. They are Homo antecessor, a species that preceded Neanderthals, and the evidence for their presence consists of footprints preserved in ancient mud at Happisburgh in Norfolk, discovered in 2013 and immediately recognized as the oldest human footprints ever found outside Africa. 5 individuals, adults and children, walking along the edge of an estuary on a cold northern shore, leaving impressions in sediment that hardened and was preserved beneath later deposits for nearly 1 million years. They are remarkable, not just because of their age, but because of what they imply. Britain has been continuously or repeatedly inhabited for almost 1 million years. The human relationship with this particular patch of land is not ancient in the casual way we use that word. It is ancient in a way that makes the word feel inadequate. But the deep prehistory of Britain is also a story of interruption. The island was not always an island. During the last ice age, which peaked around 22,000 years ago, Britain was connected to continental Europe by a broad landmass that geologists call Doggerland. This was not a narrow land bridge, but a substantial territory, perhaps as large as modern Britain itself, covering what is now the southern North Sea. People lived there. They hunted, they gathered, they built whatever they built. And then, around 8,000 years ago, as the climate warmed and the ice sheets melted, the sea levels rose and Doggerland drowned beneath what became the North Sea. The people who lived there either moved or were displaced. Their settlements, their monuments, their history, all of it lies beneath 100 meters of seawater. This matters for understanding what came next, because the people who began building in Britain after the flooding of Doggerland were not starting from nothing. They were people with a deep cultural memory of a lost homeland, with traditions and practices that had evolved over thousands of years, with a relationship to landscape and monument building that we are only beginning to understand. And they came to an island that, because of the flooding, had been effectively reset. The forests had returned after the ice, the land was wild, and they began, with what seems like extraordinary urgency, to mark it. The earliest Neolithic monuments in Britain date to around 4000 BC, or 6,000 years ago. They appear, as far as the archaeological record shows, with a suddenness that has puzzled researchers for decades. One moment, there are Mesolithic hunter-gatherers leaving their traces in middens and campsites. The next, there are massive communal construction projects, long barrows and causewayed enclosures, and wooden post circles that required not just labor, but planning, coordination, and a social structure capable of sustaining multi-generational projects. Where did this come from? The conventional answer is that farming arrived from continental Europe, bringing with it the social complexity needed for monumental construction. Agricultural communities require more organization than hunter-gatherer bands. Surplus food creates the possibility of specialist labor. Specialist labor creates the possibility of monument building. The Neolithic transition from hunting and gathering to farming was the engine that drove the construction boom. This is true as far as it goes. Genetic evidence confirms that the Neolithic farmers who built the earliest British monuments descended largely from populations that originated in Anatolia, what is now Turkey, and spread across Europe over thousands of years before arriving in Britain around 4000 BC. They replaced, to a remarkable degree, the earlier Mesolithic population. The hunting peoples who had lived in Britain for thousands of years were largely absorbed or displaced by a wave of farmers who were genetically quite distinct. But here is where it gets strange. These incoming farmers did not bring monument-building traditions with them from continental Europe. The monuments they built in Britain, particularly the Long Barrows and later the Henge monuments, have no clear precursors elsewhere. The circular henge monument form, a circular bank and ditch with interior ritual features, is essentially a British invention. It appears in Britain and then, in modified forms, in Ireland and Brittany in France, but nowhere else with the same density or variety. The people who built these structures were doing something new, something that emerged on this particular island in response to conditions and pressures that we do not yet fully understand, and they did not stop. What makes the British prehistoric record truly extraordinary is not the beginning, but the continuity. Monument building in Britain did not peak early and then decline, as happened in other parts of Europe. It continued, and in some respects intensified, across thousands of years. The Neolithic period, roughly 4000 to 2000 BC, saw the construction of the long barrows and causewayed enclosures and the first stone circles. The early Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1500 BC, saw the construction of round barrows in their hundreds of thousands, the expansion of Stonehenge, and the building of elaborate field systems and territorial boundaries across the landscape. The Late Bronze Age and Iron Age saw the construction of hill forts, of which Britain has over 3,000, more than anywhere else in Europe, and the continuation of complex landscape management on a vast scale. 3,000 hill forts. Think about that number for a moment. A hill fort is not a casual earthwork. It is a major construction project. Cutting and moving earth to create banks and ditches on a hilltop, faced with timber or stone, maintained and expanded over generations. Many British hill forts are enormous. Maiden Castle in Dorset covers 19 hectares and has defensive earthworks so complex that they have been studied by military historians as well as archaeologists. Danebury in Hampshire was occupied continuously for 500 years and at its peak probably housed a community of several hundred people within its ramparts. 3,000 of these in one country. For comparison, France has around 150 recognized Iron Age hill forts. Germany has perhaps 200. Spain has a few hundred, concentrated mainly in the north. Britain has 3,000. Why? The standard explanation is that Iron Age Britain was more politically fragmented, with more competing chiefdoms and tribal territories, requiring more defensive architecture. This is probably true, but it does not explain the scale. It does not explain why British society was more fragmented, more warlike, more obsessed with territorial demarcation than continental European societies of the same period. The explanation describes the symptom and ignores the cause. To find the cause, you have to look at something that most prehistoric archaeologists do not spend a lot of time discussing: the landscape itself. What Britain was like as a physical environment during the prehistoric period, and how that environment shaped the behavior of the people who lived in it. Britain is a geologically unusual place. Its ancient rocks are among the oldest in Europe, the mountains of Scotland and Wales containing some of the oldest surface geology on the planet. Its coastline is extraordinarily long relative to its land area, meaning that almost no part of the island is more than 70 miles from the sea. Its rivers drain in multiple directions, connecting the interior to coasts facing east, west, north, and south. Its climate is moderated by the Gulf Stream, making it warmer and wetter than its latitude would suggest. And it sits at a peculiar intersection of currents and winds that made it, in the prehistoric period, a natural crossroads for maritime cultures moving along the Atlantic coast of Europe. This last point is crucial. The Atlantic coast of Europe was not, in prehistoric times, the remote periphery it later became. It was a corridor. People moved along it by boat, trading materials, exchanging ideas, intermarrying. The tin and copper that made the Bronze Age possible came from Britain and Ireland. The gold that adorned Bronze Age aristocracies across Europe came in significant quantities from Irish and Welsh sources, and the cultural practices that spread along this Atlantic corridor, including certain traditions of monument building, seem to have found their most intense expression in Britain. But there is something else about the British landscape that is less often discussed. It remembers. Britain's combination of climate, geology, and human occupation history has preserved prehistoric monuments in ways that are unusual in Europe. The chalk downlands of southern England, where many of the most famous monuments are located, are an environment where earthworks survive extraordinarily well. Chalk is a soft rock that erodes slowly and predictably. Banks cut into chalk maintain their profile for millennia. Ditches filled with chalk rubble compact and settle, but do not vanish. The monuments of the Wiltshire Downlands look the way they do not because the people who built them were more skilled than monument builders elsewhere, but because the geology conspired to preserve their work. The peatlands of Scotland, Ireland, and northern England have preserved organic materials that would have rotted elsewhere. Timber structures, wooden tools, human remains, the wooden trackways of the Somerset levels that are now recognized as some of the earliest planned engineering projects in European prehistory. The cold, acidic conditions of the peat have acted as a natural archive, keeping things that no other environment in Europe has kept. The dry, rocky landscapes of Cornwall, Wales, the Pennines, and Scotland have preserved surface stonework because there was never enough agricultural soil to make it worth clearing the stones away. Continental European monuments were often dismantled to make way for farmland. In Britain, vast areas of upland and coastal terrain were never converted to intensive agriculture, leaving the monuments standing simply because nobody needed the stones for anything else. Britain did not necessarily build more monuments than other parts of Europe. It preserved them better. This is a significant qualification to the 30,000 site number. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than anywhere else in Europe is partly a story of survival rather than uniquely intensive construction. And the story of survival is a story of landscape, of geology, of the particular accident that made this island a good keeper of secrets, but only partly. Because when you look at the density of monuments in certain areas, the concentration in places like Wiltshire or Orkney or the Boyne Valley in Ireland, which shares many cultural characteristics with prehistoric Britain, you see something that goes beyond mere preservation. These were genuinely centres of extraordinary intensity. The labour invested here was real. The social organisation required was substantial. Something was drawing people to these places and motivating them to build on a scale that has no equivalent in continental Europe. And this is where the dark part of the story begins. The monuments are not random. They are not scattered evenly across the landscape in the way you would expect if they simply reflected population density or agricultural productivity. They cluster in patterns. They align with astronomical events. They are positioned in relation to each other in ways that suggest deliberate planning across vast distances and long time spans. The builders of these monuments were doing something intentional, something coordinated, and what they were coordinating was not just labour, it was meaning. Consider the alignment of the monuments. Stonehenge aligns with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. The Passage Tomb at Newgrange in Ireland, often grouped with British monuments because of its close cultural connections, aligns precisely with the midwinter sunrise. The Chambered Cairn at Maeshowe on Orkney aligns with the midwinter sunset. The Callanish Stone Circle on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland aligns with the southernmost rising of the moon, a lunar event that only occurs once every 18 and a half years. These are not coincidences. They are engineering. They represent a sustained, sophisticated, multi-generational program of astronomical observation and monumentalization. The people building these structures understood the movements of the sun and moon to a degree of precision that is genuinely impressive even by modern standards. They tracked the lunar standstill cycle, they identified the exact cardinal directions, they understood that the sunrise point on the horizon shifts across the year in a predictable pattern, and used that knowledge to orient their monuments in ways that would create specific lighting effects on specific days. This is not primitive. This is science. Ancient science conducted without mathematics in the formal sense, without writing, without instruments beyond the human eye, but science nonetheless. And it is science that served a purpose. The astronomical alignments of prehistoric monuments are not decorative, they are functional. A monument that illuminates its interior on the winter solstice is not doing so because its builders thought it would look nice. It is doing so because the winter solstice was a critical moment in the ritual calendar, the moment when the sun's declining power visibly reverses, the moment when the lengthening nights begin to shorten again. This was probably the most important day of the year in any culture that depended on agriculture, because it was the moment when the anxiety of winter began to lift, when the promise of spring became visible in the very movement of the light. To be able to mark that moment precisely, to build a structure that made the sun's return visible and dramatic and communal, was an act of power. It was proof that the builders understood the cosmos, that they could predict its behavior, that they were, in some sense, in communication with forces that ordinary people could not access. This is the origin of priesthood. This is the origin of sacred authority. And it is why the people who built these monuments were not just farmers or laborers or even sophisticated engineers. They were the keepers of knowledge that held communities together across the terrifying uncertainty of a world without writing, without recorded history, without any way of knowing, except through accumulated observation and tradition, whether the sun would return. The monuments are archives. They are not written records, but they are records nonetheless. They preserve, in stone and earth, astronomical knowledge that was too important to trust to memory alone. They are the writing of a pre-literate civilization, the permanent inscription of the most critical knowledge those people possessed. And this helps explain why there are so many of them, and why Britain has so many. A society that builds monuments to preserve and display critical knowledge will keep building monuments as long as it has critical knowledge to preserve. And in prehistoric Britain, something kept giving these people reasons to build. Something kept generating new knowledge, new concerns, new needs for monumental expression. Something sustained the program across thousands of years and multiple technological shifts, from wood to earth to stone, from simple to complex, from local to regional, to something that looks almost like a national program of ritual landscape construction. What was that something? Here is where the comfortable narrative ends and the darker interpretation begins. The monuments of prehistoric Britain are not only memorials to astronomical knowledge, they are also, in enormous numbers, memorials to the dead. The long barrows that predate the stone circles are fundamentally burial structures, but not burial in the way we typically understand the term. The dead were not simply interred, they were managed. Bones were sorted, curated, moved. Different body parts from different individuals were mixed together. Skulls were removed and placed in specific locations within chambers. In some cases, the bones were periodically brought out and used in ceremonies before being returned to the monument. The dead were not finished with. They were active participants in the life of the community. This practice has a name in anthropology, secondary burial, and it is associated globally with cultures that maintain a strong ancestor cult, a belief that the dead continue to have power and agency in the world of the living, and that maintaining a relationship with the dead through ritual attention is essential for community well-being. The ancestors must be consulted. The ancestors must be honored. The ancestors must be kept close. In prehistoric Britain, this relationship with the dead was apparently extremely intense. The long barrows are often described as houses for the dead, but this phrase is usually taken as metaphorical. It may not be. The chambers in which the bones were kept are constructed with the same architectural vocabulary as the houses of the living. Entrances facing specific directions, interior spaces divided in specific ways, elaborated with the same materials and techniques. The dead were not put away in a separate realm. They were housed in structures that were conceptually continuous with the houses of the living, kept within the community, kept accessible, kept real, and kept powerful. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than any other country in Europe is partly this. The dead accumulated, and with every generation of dead, there was a need to build something, to house them, to honor them, to maintain the relationship. In a society that believes ancestors have power, ancestors are not a burden. They are a resource. A community that can claim kinship with a long line of powerful dead has social capital that a community without such monuments cannot match. The monuments are not just houses for the dead. They are advertisements for the living. They say, look at how many ancestors we have. Look at how powerful our dead are. Look at what they built and what we continue to maintain. This territory is ours. This landscape is ours. These ancestors are ours, and that makes us strong. This is competitive monument building, and it escalates. Once one community builds a large long barrow, neighboring communities face social pressure to match it. Once a stone circle is raised that aligns with the midsummer sunrise, other groups who want to claim the same cosmic authority need to build their own. Once the landscape begins to fill with monuments, each new monument is not just an expression of belief, but a statement in an ongoing argument about prestige, about territory, about authority, about whose ancestors are more powerful and whose community deserves more resources. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than anywhere else in Europe is that this competition never quite ended. It did not peak in one period and then decline. It was sustained in different forms across thousands of years because the social logic that drove it never disappeared. The need to claim the landscape through monumental construction, the need to display ancestral power, the need to mark territory with permanent structures that said we were here and we built this and it will outlast us. This need was woven into the social fabric of successive cultures on this island in a way that it was not woven into the fabric of contemporary cultures on the continent. Why Britain specifically? Why this island rather than some other corner of Europe? Part of the answer may be in the island's geography. An island is a bounded space. You cannot expand forever in all directions. The land has edges, and those edges create an intensity of competition for territory and resources that is different from what occurs on a continent where expansion is always possible. The communities of prehistoric Britain were, in a sense, competing in a closed system. They could not simply move away when the competition became intense. They had to negotiate, to assert, to fight, and one of the primary tools of assertion in a pre-literate society is the monument. Build bigger, build more. Build in places that demonstrate your knowledge of the cosmos and your connection to the land. Part of the answer may also be in the particular geological richness of the island. Britain has granite and sandstone and chalk and limestone and slate and flint, a variety of rock types within a small area that gave monument builders options unavailable to people living in more geologically uniform landscapes. The bluestones of Stonehenge were transported from Wales not just because stone was unavailable locally, but because those particular stones, from those particular outcrops, had meaning. Different stones carried different symbolic weight. The variety of Britain's geology meant that different communities could associate themselves with different stones, different materials, different sources of building material that carried specific cultural significance. And part of the answer, the darkest part, may be in what these monuments were ultimately built against. The prehistoric period in Britain was not a time of stable, comfortable agricultural abundance. It was a time of repeated environmental stress, demographic collapse, and cultural transformation. The population of Neolithic Britain was not large, perhaps 100,000 people in 4000 BC, spread across a large island. Disease, crop failures, and climate fluctuations could devastate communities within a generation. The archaeological record of the early Neolithic shows evidence of sudden population crashes, communities that simply stop leaving archaeological traces, sites that are abandoned and not reoccupied. Building massive, permanent structures in this context is not simply an expression of confidence, it is an act of defiance. When your community is threatened by forces it does not understand and cannot control, when people are dying of diseases that seem to come from nowhere, when harvests fail for reasons that have no apparent cause, when the world seems fundamentally uncertain and terrifying, you build something permanent. You build something that will still be here when you are gone. You mark your presence in the landscape in a way that says we existed, we mattered, we were here. The monuments of prehistoric Britain are not only celebrations, they are also laments. They are the material expression of a people who understood, perhaps more deeply than we do, how fragile and temporary human life is, and who responded by trying to make something that would last. They succeeded, the monuments lasted. The people who built them did not in any continuous, traceable, historically recoverable way. The culture of the late Neolithic, the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury and Silbury Hill, was largely replaced by incoming Bronze Age peoples from the continent around 2000 BC, a cultural shift so complete that the monument building tradition was interrupted and then restarted by the newcomers in modified form. The Bronze Age people who came built their round barrows by the thousand, honouring their own dead in their own way. Then they in turn were overlaid by the Iron Age cultures that built the hill forts. Then the Celts, then the Romans, then the Saxons, then the Vikings, then the Normans. Layer upon layer of replacement, each incoming group leaving their own marks on a landscape already saturated with the marks of everyone who had come before. And through all of it, the original monuments survived. Not because anyone decided to protect them, not because they were recognized as historically significant in any formal sense. They survived because they were simply too large to remove, too deeply embedded in the landscape to erase, too physically monumental to overcome, even with centuries of agriculture and settlement pressing against them. The farms grew up around them, the villages built themselves beside them, the roads curved to avoid them, and the monuments endured. This is the dark reason. The monuments survived because they were built with a kind of desperate permanence, a burning need to outlast the people who made them, and they did exactly what they were built to do. They outlasted everyone. They outlasted the culture that built them, the religion that inspired them, the astronomical knowledge that oriented them, the language that named them, the social structure that organized their construction. They outlasted it all, and now they sit in the British countryside, 30,000 of them, waiting for us to understand what they meant. We do not understand. Not fully, not yet. What we do understand is that this island was the site of an extraordinary human experiment. An experiment in what happens when a bounded population, under continuous competitive pressure, with a deep tradition of ancestor reverence and astronomical observation, has access to abundant building materials and a geology that preserves what is built. The result is an archive, 30,000 sites that together form the most complete record of prehistoric human activity on the planet. We should be asking much louder questions about what that archive says. Let us talk about something that the tour guides at Stonehenge do not typically mention: the bones. The archaeological excavations at Stonehenge and the surrounding monuments have produced an extraordinary quantity of human skeletal material, and the patterns in that material are deeply strange. At Stonehenge itself, in the area known as the Aubrey Holes, the ring of pits that forms the outermost circle of the monument, cremated human remains have been found dating to every phase of the monument's construction history. Stonehenge was a cremation cemetery before it was a stone circle. The Aubrey Holes contained the ashes of at least 63 individuals, and probably many more, placed there over a period of 500 years. People were being cremated and interred at Stonehenge for 5 centuries before anyone raised the first standing stones. Who were these people? Isotope analysis of the bones tells us something remarkable. Many of them were not local. The strontium and oxygen isotopes locked in the cremated bone fragments indicate that a significant proportion of the individuals buried at Stonehenge came from Western Britain, possibly from Wales, the same region from which the bluestones were transported. People were travelling to this site from hundreds of miles away to be cremated and interred within its boundaries. Or, alternatively, people were dying somewhere else, and their remains were carried to this site for final interment. Either way, Stonehenge was not a local monument serving a local community. It was a regional or possibly national site of mortuary significance, drawing the dead from across the island. This is extraordinary. Moving 50-ton stones is impressive, but it is also fundamentally a one-time effort for each stone. Moving the cremated remains of the dead to a central mortuary site is a sustained, ongoing, culturally embedded practice. It means that communities across southern Britain shared a belief about where the dead should ultimately rest, and that belief was strong enough to motivate the repeated, effortful transportation of human ashes across large distances. These people cared intensely and collectively about where the dead ended up. What did they believe about where the dead go? We do not know, but the physical evidence suggests a belief system in which the location of deposition mattered enormously. The dead at Stonehenge were placed within a structure that aligned with the sun. Perhaps they believed that proximity to the sun's most powerful moments, the solstices, the moments of maximum and minimum light, was beneficial for the dead. Perhaps the alignment created a pathway between the world of the dead and the world of the living, a moment each year when the boundary between those worlds became permeable. Perhaps the location gave the dead a view, a position from which they could see the same sunrise or sunset that their descendants would gather to observe. We are speculating, but the speculation is not idle. The monuments force speculation about the deepest questions of human experience. What happens after death? Is there a way to maintain connection across the gap? Does the location of the body matter? Does the orientation of the tomb matter? Does the light that enters the burial chamber matter? These are questions that every human culture has asked, and the answers that any culture arrives at are visible in how it treats its dead. The answers of prehistoric Britain are written in 30,000 sites across one island, and they suggest that the answer these people arrived at was, yes, everything matters, the location matters, the orientation matters, the light matters, the stones used matter, the community gathered for the ceremony matters. Nothing is incidental. Everything has meaning. Everything is connected to everything else in a web of significance that holds the cosmos together. This is not a primitive worldview. It is a comprehensive one. It is a worldview in which human existence is not separate from the natural world, but embedded within it, responsive to it, oriented in relation to it. And building monuments was how these people made that orientation physical and permanent. Every stone circle, every burial mound, every hill fort, every stone alignment was an act of cosmic orientation. a statement about where the builders stood in relation to the sun and moon and stars, in relation to their ancestors and descendants, in relation to the land they lived on, and the forces they believed moved through it. The monuments are not ruins, they are arguments. They are arguments for a particular understanding of what the universe is and what human beings are doing in it. And they were made permanent because their builders understood that arguments need to be made again and again, generation after generation. And the most efficient way to make a permanent argument is to build something that will outlast you. This is the real reason Britain has more ancient ruins than anywhere else in Europe. The people who built them were engaged in an argument that never quite concluded, a sustained attempt to orient themselves in a cosmos that was beautiful and terrifying and apparently indifferent to human survival, and to mark that orientation in the landscape, so that everyone who came after would know where they stood. And we are still here, 30,000 monuments later, still trying to figure out what they were saying. Let us move now from the monuments themselves to the people who built them, because the history of prehistoric Britain is not, as many people assume, a continuous narrative of a single people evolving in place across thousands of years. It is a story of repeated replacement, of waves of incoming populations who displaced or were absorbed by the peoples who came before them, each leaving their own monuments on the landscape while inheriting and reinterpreting the monuments of their predecessors. And this pattern of replacement has its own dark story, a story that raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of cultural continuity and the meaning of historical ownership. The genetic revolution in archaeology has transformed our understanding of who built what in prehistoric Britain. Ancient DNA analysis, pioneered over the last decade, has made it possible to extract genetic material from prehistoric skeletons and compare it to modern populations and to each other. What that analysis has revealed is stark. The Neolithic farmers who built the earliest British monuments, the long barrows and causewayed enclosures of the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, were genetically distinct from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who preceded them. They were also genetically distinct from the Bronze Age peoples who followed them. The population of Neolithic Britain was largely replaced, within a few centuries around 2000 BC, by people carrying a genetic signature associated with the Yamnaya culture of the Eurasian steppe. These newcomers brought with them the genetic heritage of nomadic herders from the region north of the Caspian Sea. They also brought horses and wheels, and probably the ancestor of the Celtic languages spoken across much of prehistoric Britain. They mixed with the existing Neolithic population, but came to dominate it genetically to a remarkable degree. Within a few generations of their arrival, the genetic profile of Britain had been transformed. What happened to the Neolithic people? They did not disappear overnight. They interbred with the newcomers. Their genes survive in modern British people, diluted. Their monuments survive in the landscape, adopted. But their culture, their specific belief system, their particular form of monument building, their way of managing the dead, these things changed dramatically. The long barrows stopped being built. The causewayed enclosures fell out of use. The circular henges were still visited, but their function may have shifted. Something that had animated the Neolithic culture of Britain for 2,000 years simply ended, not because of war or disease necessarily, though both may have played a role, but because the people who carried it were absorbed into a new cultural synthesis that honored the old monuments without fully understanding them. This is one of the dark reasons the monuments survived. They outlasted the people who understood them. By the time historical records begin to mention the monuments, in the Roman period, even the ancient Britons of 2,000 years ago had no memory of who built the oldest of the monuments or why. Julius Caesar and other Roman writers who described Britain mentioned the Druids, the priestly class of Iron Age Celtic society, and later traditions associated the Druids with sites like Stonehenge. But Stonehenge was already 2,000 years old when the Druids lived. The Druids no more built Stonehenge than medieval Christians built the Parthenon. The monument was ancient to them too. The Druids may have used Stonehenge for their own ceremonies. The site may have retained some aura of sacredness across the millennia, drawing successive cultures to use it without understanding it. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of monuments. Sacred sites have a way of remaining sacred, even as the religion that created them changes. The reasons for the sacredness shift. The specific beliefs that animated the original construction are replaced by new beliefs that find in the ancient structure a resonance they cannot fully explain. And so the monument survives, protected by an aura of sanctity that predates and will probably outlast any particular religion. Stonehenge in the Roman period may have been a shrine. In the medieval period, it was described with awe and attributed to giants or to Merlin, the magician of Arthurian legend, who was said to have transported the stones magically from Ireland. In the early modern period, it became a symbol of British antiquity and national pride. In the 19th century, it became the subject of serious archaeological investigation. In the 20th century, it became a global tourist attraction and a focus of neo-pagan revival, with modern Druids gathering at the summer solstice in a ceremony that has no documented continuity with anything that happened at the site in its original construction period, but which expresses an authentic human need to connect with the ancient and the astronomical. The monument keeps being reinterpreted, the monument keeps being relevant, and so the monument keeps being preserved. This is perhaps the deepest reason Britain has more ancient ruins than anywhere else in Europe. Not just geology, not just a peculiarly intense tradition of monument building, not just competitive ancestor veneration, but the fact that the monuments kept being valued by each successive culture, even as the original meaning was lost. Each new people who came to Britain found in the existing monuments something that they needed: a connection to the past, a territorial claim through association, a source of sacred authority, a reminder of human smallness in the face of time. The monuments were not preserved despite the changes in population and culture. They were preserved because of those changes, because each new culture found a reason to keep them. The Saxons who conquered Britain in the post-Roman period built their settlements near prehistoric earthworks. The Normans who conquered Britain in 1066 incorporated prehistoric mounds into their castle designs, placing their wooden towers on top of Bronze Age burial mounds in a gesture that merged new military power with ancient spiritual authority. The medieval church built its earliest British monasteries near prehistoric sites, sometimes literally on top of them, incorporating the sanctity of the older place into the newly established Christian sacred geography. Every conquest, every cultural transformation, every religious change in British history has involved a negotiation with the ancient monuments. None of the incoming peoples simply destroyed what they found. They adopted it, they incorporated it, they built on top of it and around it and in dialogue with it. And the monuments endured. Now let us ask the question that this history leads inevitably toward, even if it is uncomfortable to ask directly. What does it mean for a landscape to be so thoroughly saturated with the marks of the dead? What does it do to a culture, across centuries and millennia, to live always in the presence of monuments you did not build, whose meaning you no longer remember, whose builders you cannot name or claim as ancestors? What does it do to a people to inherit the traces of someone else's conversation with the cosmos? Britain is, in this sense, haunted, not in the ghost story sense, though the British tradition of ghost stories is itself deeply interesting and possibly connected to this landscape of unremembered ancestors. It is haunted in the more precise sense that the landscape carries traces of lives and beliefs and intentions that have not been inherited but not erased. Every British person who has stood inside a stone circle at dawn and felt something that they cannot quite name, something between awe and unease, and a peculiar sense of recognition is feeling the residue of this haunting. The stones were placed to be felt that way. The orientation was chosen to create that particular experience of light entering a space at a particular moment. The feeling is not accidental, it is engineered by people who are gone, but whose engineering remains. This is what it means to have 30,000 ancient ruins. Not just a rich archaeological record, not just a diverse tourism landscape, not just a source of national pride and historical mystique. It means living in a landscape that was shaped by the dead for the dead, that carries the marks of every culture that has ever tried to make its presence permanent in this particular patch of earth. It means the past is not past. It is underfoot. It is visible on every hilltop. It is in the farmer's field and the city park and the suburban back garden, where planning applications sometimes halt when a buried ditch or post hole appears in the subsoil and reveals the invisible archaeology that underlies all of modern Britain. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe is that Britain is a place where people have refused, across the longest span of human history on this island, to let the dead go. The monuments are the material expression of that refusal, and they outlasted the people who made them, as they were always meant to do. Let us go deeper into the landscape. Let us move beyond the famous monuments, beyond Stonehenge and Avebury, and the sites that appear in every documentary and every tourist itinerary, and into the parts of Britain that are less visited but equally strange, equally saturated with the marks of ancient intention. Because the famous sites are in a sense the loudest part of the argument. The subtler parts are in some ways more interesting, precisely because they have not been smoothed over by tourism and interpretation boards and the comfortable certainties of official archaeology. Begin in the north. In Scotland and the Northern Isles, there is a tradition of prehistoric monument building that diverges interestingly from the southern English tradition that most people are familiar with. The stone circles of Scotland are often smaller and in some cases more elaborate in their internal construction than their southern equivalents. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire, peculiar to that corner of Scotland, feature a large horizontal stone placed in a specific sector of the circle with flanking uprights on either side, oriented consistently toward the southwest quadrant of the sky. The recumbent stone, from the right position within the circle, frames the moon at its southern extreme, the lunar standstill that the Callanish circle also references. These are not coincidences. They are evidence of a sophisticated tradition of lunar observation and monumentalization that existed across Scotland, apparently independently of but in some kind of dialogue with the solar traditions of southern England. Why would communities 200 or 300 miles apart, separated by formidable terrain, develop similar astronomical knowledge and express it in similar monumental forms? The orthodox answer is cultural contact through trade networks. People exchanged goods, including the polished stone axes that circulated across Britain in the Neolithic period, coming from specific quarry sources in Wales and the Lake District, and being found hundreds of miles away. With the axes went ideas. With the trade goods went knowledge. The lunar traditions of Scotland and the solar traditions of southern England were not separate, but part of a single, island-wide conversation about the relationship between human communities and the heavens. But the conversation had regional dialects. The specific forms it took in different parts of the island were distinct. Aberdeenshire recumbent stone circles looked like nothing built anywhere else. The claver cairns of the Inverness area, small circular burial cairns with entrance passages oriented to the southwest, incorporating quartz in their construction in ways that may have been connected to beliefs about light and transformation, are local to a relatively small part of the Scottish Highlands. The curbed cairns and boulder circles of Western Scotland follow their own logic, their own aesthetic, their own engagement with the landscape. The tradition was unified by broad themes: the importance of astronomical orientation, the relationship between monuments and the dead, the need to mark territory and claim landscape. But it expressed those themes in extraordinary variety. Variety is itself informative. If prehistoric Britain had been a single, unified culture with a single religious authority imposing uniformity on monument building practice, you would expect less variety. The fact that there is so much local variation suggests that the tradition was decentralized. Different communities developed their own solutions to shared problems. Different regional centers emerged at different times. The knowledge spread through the trade networks, but was adapted and modified by each receiving community according to its own circumstances, its own available materials, its own cosmological emphasis. This is not the behavior of a society with a centralized church or state. It is the behavior of a society with a shared intellectual and spiritual inheritance that was interpreted locally by specialist knowledge holders, whose authority derived from that knowledge. The builders of these monuments were not following instructions from a central authority. They were engaging in a common tradition that gave them enormous latitude for local expression, while constraining them within certain broad parameters of orientation, form, and purpose. Who were the specialist knowledge holders? We do not know their specific role in the social hierarchy. We do not know what they were called, but their existence is implied by the monuments themselves. The astronomical knowledge required to orient a passage tomb or a stone circle correctly is not the kind of knowledge that everyone in the community would have possessed. It required years of observation, careful record keeping through whatever mnemonic systems they used, and the ability to translate that knowledge into spatial and architectural decisions. Somebody knew how to do this. Somebody held the knowledge. And the fact that the knowledge was held and transmitted across generations, in some cases for 2,000 years or more, suggests that the social mechanisms for holding and transmitting it were robust and stable. These were the people who were ultimately in charge, not the strongest warrior or the man with the most cattle. The person who could tell you exactly when to plant and when to harvest, exactly when the moon would do the thing that needed to be done, for the ceremony that the dead required, exactly how to orient the chamber so that the light would enter on the day it needed to enter. This person was, in any pre-literate agricultural society, indispensable, and the monuments they directed were the most visible manifestation of their indispensability. This is one of the reasons the monuments are so numerous. Every community needed its own specialist, and every specialist, to maintain their authority and demonstrate their knowledge, needed to build something. The monuments are credentials. They are the curriculum vitae of prehistoric knowledge holders, written in stone and earth for the entire community to see and remember. Consider what it would mean to be the person in your community who knows when the sun will rise over that particular horizon point. Who knows that in 3 years, when the moon reaches its southern extreme, you need to perform a specific ceremony to ensure the continuity of the community's relationship with the dead ancestors whose bones are in the chamber. Who knows which stones from which quarries have the right kind of power, whatever that meant in their specific cosmological framework, for the structure they are planning to build. You are not just a priest or an astronomer or an architect. You are all three. And your authority depends on your ability to keep performing your knowledge in ways that produce visible results. The sunrise over the heelstone at Stonehenge, year after year, precisely where you said it would be. The midwinter light entering the Maycho chamber and striking the back wall at exactly the angle it struck last year and the year before. The ceremony going correctly because you knew what needed to be done. The monument is proof. The monument is what you point to when someone questions your authority. The monument says, "Look at what I knew how to build. Look at what I knew how to orient. Look at how many generations of the dead are safely housed within it." You cannot argue with a structure that has been standing for 500 years and which continues to perform its astronomical function year after year without variation. The cosmos itself endorses the monument, and by endorsing the monument, endorses the knowledge that built it. This is the deep social function of prehistoric monumentality. Not religion in the doctrinal sense, not science in the modern sense, not engineering for practical purposes, but the embodiment and display of knowledge that was literally life-giving in a world where the wrong planting time could mean starvation and the wrong relationship with the dead could mean catastrophe of a kind we can only imagine. The monuments are buildings, but they are also arguments, and they are also power structures, and they are also filing systems for the most critical knowledge that any prehistoric community possessed. And Britain is where the argument was made most loudly, most persistently, and most durably. Let us look at another dark corner of this story, the question of sacrifice. The British prehistoric record contains evidence that is difficult to interpret and more difficult to discuss, without either sensationalizing it or sanitizing it. The evidence suggests that human sacrifice, or something very like it, played a role in the construction and use of some British monuments. This evidence is not conclusive. Archaeologists are rightly cautious about attributing mortuary practices to deliberate killing rather than natural death followed by ceremonial interment. But in certain cases, the evidence is hard to read any other way. At the causewayed enclosure of Hambledon Hill in Dorset, excavated over several years in the 1970s and 1980s, the excavator Roger Mercer found evidence that troubled him deeply. In the ditches of the enclosure, beneath deposits of chalk rubble, were human bones, but not complete skeletons. The bones were disarticulated, mixed together, and in some cases accompanied by evidence of deliberate processing. The bones of children appeared with particular frequency. Some showed signs of having been exposed to the elements before deposition, suggesting that bodies had been left out in the open, perhaps on platforms or scaffolds, for a period before the bones were gathered and placed in the ditch. The overall impression was of a site where the dead were processed, displayed, and ultimately deposited in a way that was clearly ritualized, but equally clearly difficult to categorize within any framework we can easily recognize. Mercer described the site as a place of the dead, but he was careful not to specify the manner of their dying. The bones could represent people who died naturally and were then subjected to elaborate mortuary treatment. They could represent people who were killed deliberately as sacrificial victims. The distinction in the archaeological record is almost impossible to make with certainty. Cut marks on bones can result from defleshing of the naturally dead as easily as from the killing of sacrificial victims. The age distribution, the apparent overrepresentation of young children, is suspicious because children die in greater numbers than adults in pre-medical societies for natural reasons. It does not have to mean anything dark, but in combination with other lines of evidence, the picture becomes harder to dismiss. At Woodhenge, a timber circle near Stonehenge that predates the stone monument, excavations in the 1920s uncovered the skeleton of a child at the center of the monument. The child, between 3 and 4 years old, had a split skull. The split was interpreted by the excavators as a deliberate killing blow, and the child as a dedicatory sacrifice interred at the center of the monument during its construction. This interpretation has been questioned. The skull could have been damaged in other ways. The death could have been accidental. But the location, precisely at the center of the monument, is not easily explained by natural burial patterns. At the site of Seahenge, the remarkable timber circle discovered on the Norfolk coast in 1998, a massive inverted tree stump stood at the center of a ring of timber posts. The tree stump was upside down, roots in the air, a deliberate and symbolically charged choice that clearly meant something to the people who placed it there. Around the base of the stump, no human remains were found, but the construction itself, the inversion of the natural order it represents, speaks of a worldview in which deliberate reversal and transformation, the living made dead, the rooted made airborne, were powerful ritual acts. The line between symbolic sacrifice and literal sacrifice is not always clear. The Druids of the Iron Age were described by classical authors, including Julius Caesar and Tacitus, as practitioners of human sacrifice. Caesar described human figures made of wicker, filled with people, and set alight. Tacitus described the sacred grove of the Druids on the island of Anglesey as a place of blood sacrifice. These descriptions come from hostile observers and may be propagandistic exaggeration. The Romans had political reasons to paint the peoples they were conquering as barbaric, but the descriptions were repeated by multiple independent authors and contain specific details that suggest, at minimum, that the authors believed what they were describing. And the British bog bodies complicate the picture significantly. The preserved remains of individuals found in peat bogs across Britain and Ireland, dating from the Iron Age and earlier, show patterns that are hard to explain except as sacrifice. Lindow Man, found in Cheshire in 1984, was a man in his 20s who had been hit on the head, strangled with a twisted cord, and had his throat cut. He was then placed face down in a bog. The three separate means of killing, hitting, strangling, and cutting have been interpreted as a threefold death consistent with ritual sacrifice practices described in medieval Irish and Welsh mythological texts. He was also, isotope analysis suggests, well-fed, healthy, and not someone at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Sacrificial victims in many cultures were not the weakest members of the group. They were the chosen. Their value made the sacrifice more powerful. Tolland Man from Denmark, the best preserved of the European bog bodies, shows the same pattern. A man in good health, well-nourished, killed by hanging with a braided cord, placed carefully in a bog in a position that suggests someone laid him out with care, not someone disposing of a body in haste. The care taken with these bodies, even in death, suggests that the people who killed them did not consider what they were doing to be murder. They considered it necessary. They considered it holy. What were they buying with these lives? The bogs were liminal spaces, the boundary between land and water, solid and liquid, living and dead. Crossing that boundary was the appropriate metaphor for the transition between worlds. The bog was a place where the living world and the world of the dead, or the gods, or whatever beings were believed to inhabit the other side of reality, came close together. Placing a sacrificed individual in that space was placing them at the threshold, making them a messenger or an offering to whatever inhabited the other side. The monuments, too, are liminal spaces. The chamber of a passage tomb is a threshold. The interior of a stone circle is set apart from the surrounding landscape by the stones themselves, defined as a different kind of space. The long barrow entrance is a door between worlds, all the places where extraordinary things were done, where the dead were housed, where offerings were made, where ceremonies were performed, are places that defined themselves as different from ordinary space. Sacred space, liminal space, the space where the boundary between the human and whatever is larger than human becomes thin. Britain is saturated with these spaces, 30,000 of them by conservative count. 30,000 places where the ancient people of this island chose to thin the boundary between worlds, to place a stone or a post or a bank of earth that said here. Here is different. Here something can be asked of forces larger than us, and perhaps answered. What were they asking? What did they fear? What did they want? Survival, continuation, the sun returning after midwinter, the crops growing after planting, the children surviving infancy, the dead finding their way to wherever it is that the dead go, the community holding together against the uncertainty and terror of a world that killed its people, randomly, that brought disease without warning, famine without apparent cause, storms without explanation, death without meaning. They were asking for meaning, and the monuments were their way of insisting that meaning was available, that the universe was not random, that the patterns they observed in the sky and the landscape were real patterns imposed by forces that could be addressed, that could be pleased or appeased or thanked or bargained with. The monuments are the material expression of the belief that the universe makes sense, that it has a pattern, that the pattern can be read, and that reading the pattern correctly and building structures that embody the reading will help your community survive. This is not so different from what modern science does. The alignment of the Maisho Passage with the midwinter sunset was not a decorative choice. It was an act of science, of the kind of science available to people without instruments or mathematics, a careful, sustained, multi-generational observation of a real pattern in the natural world, encoded in physical form so that the knowledge would not be lost when the individual observer died. The astronomy is real. The pattern is real. The light enters the passage on the winter solstice because the passage is aligned with the winter solstice, and that alignment required accurate observation and precise construction. The interpretation placed on that pattern, the belief that the light entering the chamber connected the living and the dead at the moment of the sun's rebirth, was the community's way of making that real pattern meaningful. We make patterns meaningful too. We just use different metaphors. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than any other country in Europe is not simply about geology or competitive ancestor veneration or island geography. It is about the sustained, desperate, and extraordinarily inventive human effort to make meaning in the face of a universe that offers no guarantees. These people built not because building was easy, but because it was necessary. They built not because they had unlimited labor and resources, but because the alternative, failing to build, failing to house the dead properly, failing to mark the solstice, failing to demonstrate through permanent structures that their community understood the cosmos and maintained the right relationship with the forces that sustained it, that alternative was unthinkable. So they built, and built, and built, and the building accumulated across thousands of years until the island was saturated with it, until there was no significant hill or valley or coastline that did not carry the mark of some community's attempt to orient itself in relation to the cosmos and the dead and the uncertain future. And then the culture that had done all that building was replaced, its people absorbed and diluted by newcomers, its specific beliefs and practices lost, its monuments inherited by people who admired them without understanding them and preserved them without knowing why. And the monuments are still there, 30,000 of them, waiting. Now let us take this investigation somewhere unexpected, because the story of Britain's ruins does not end with the prehistoric period. The Roman occupation that began in 43 AD and ended around 410 AD added an entirely new layer of ruins to the British landscape, and those ruins raised their own dark questions. The Romans did not simply build in Britain and then leave. They built an extraordinary quantity of infrastructure, roads and forts and temples and towns and villas, and the most famous of all, Hadrian's Wall. And then when they left virtually all of it behind. Hadrian's Wall stretches 73 miles across northern England, from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east. It was built beginning in 122 AD on the orders of the Emperor Hadrian, following his visit to Britain, and was completed in approximately 6 years using the labor of 3 Roman legions. It is made of stone in its eastern section and turf in the west, with a series of 16 major forts, numerous smaller fortlets, and observation towers called mile castles at regular intervals. It was not just a wall, it was a military command center, a customs barrier, a communications network, and a statement of imperial power stretching across an entire landscape. It also, by the time the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, was already being stripped for building material by local communities. The farms and villages and churches of medieval northern England were built partly from Hadrian's Wall. The sandstone blocks were just lying there, already dressed and cut, free for the taking. The wall was not so much abandoned as cannibalized, recycled into the continuing fabric of settlement that did not stop just because the empire that built the wall had collapsed. What remains is still formidable. The central section of the wall, across the high ground of the windsill, is preserved in stretches that reach their original height of 3 or 4 meters, with the ditch in front still visible and the military road behind still traceable in the modern landscape. The forts at Housesteads and Vindolanda have been extensively excavated and reveal the daily life of Roman soldiers stationed on this remote frontier with extraordinary intimacy. At Vindolanda, the combination of anaerobic conditions in the waterlogged soil below the fort has preserved organic materials that would have rotted elsewhere: leather shoes, textiles, wooden objects, and most remarkably, writing tablets, thin slivers of wood covered with ink text that represent the oldest handwritten documents found in Britain. These tablets are extraordinarily moving. They are ordinary correspondence. A soldier writing home for more warm socks because the Northumbrian winter is colder than anything he experienced back in his Mediterranean home. A party invitation from one commanding officer's wife to another. A request for supplies, a complaint about the behavior of a subordinate. These are the voices of ordinary people, living in an extraordinary moment of history, their words surviving 2,000 years, because the soil at Vindolanda happened to be the right kind of wet and cold and acidic to preserve them. But the Vindolanda tablets also raise questions that are not so comfortable, because the people speaking in these tablets are the conquerors. The people not speaking, except as occasional mentions, the Britonculi, the wretched little Britons, as one tablet disparagingly calls them, are the conquered. The Romans built their wall and their forts on land that belonged to people who had been using it for thousands of years. The monuments those people had built were already ancient when the Romans arrived. The Romans were not the beginning of British history. They were one episode in a story that was already thousands of years old, and they left their ruins on top of ruins that were already deep. The layering is the point. What makes Britain so extraordinarily rich in ancient remains is partly that it is so extraordinarily layered. Every period of construction occurred on a landscape that was already marked by previous construction. The Romans built their roads partially following prehistoric trackways, because the trackways followed the easiest routes, and the easiest routes had been obvious for thousands of years. The medieval churches were built on sites that had been sacred in the pre-Christian period because the church found it easier to sanctify what was already considered holy than to demand that people abandon the places that had meaning for them. The Norman castles were built on Bronze Age burial mounds because the mound provided an elevation advantage and the existing earthwork made the construction easier. Each layer uses the layer below it, incorporates it, builds on it, and in doing so preserves it. The mound under the castle motte is intact because the castle preserved it. The prehistoric enclosure beneath the medieval village survives because the village streets followed its boundaries. The Iron Age hill fort is still visible on the hilltop because the later farmland stopped at its ramparts. Britain's 30,000 ancient sites are not survivals despite the human activity that has covered them. They are survivals because of the human activity that has covered them, protected them, been organised around them. This is the paradox at the heart of the British archaeological landscape. The very density of human occupation that you might expect to have destroyed the ancient remains has instead preserved them, because dense occupation means that nothing is ever completely abandoned. Sites that are still being used are still being maintained, however passively. A mound that has someone's house on it will not be ploughed flat. An earthwork that forms the boundary of a field will not be levelled. A stone circle that people continue to visit for whatever reasons, superstitious, curious, agricultural, will not be entirely dismantled. The survival of Britain's prehistoric monuments is a collective act, sustained across thousands of years by millions of individual decisions not to destroy. Most of those decisions were not conscious. Nobody in the Middle Ages was trying to preserve Stonehenge for posterity. But they also were not trying to destroy it. It was there. It was old. It was big. It was in some sense frightening. Better to leave it alone. And so it survived. The scale of this collective act of preservation is itself extraordinary. It required every generation of every community across every part of Britain to make essentially the same decision, to work around the monuments rather than through them, to incorporate them into the continuing landscape rather than erasing them. The result is that Britain is not just a country with many ancient monuments. It is a country where the ancient monuments are woven into the fabric of the landscape so thoroughly that the landscape cannot be understood without them. They are not anomalies. They are landmarks in the original sense. Marks on the land that orient everyone who moves through it, that provide reference points and meanings and a sense of depth that a landscape without them cannot have. Stand on Silbury Hill on a clear day and you can see Avebury to the north, the West Kennet Long Barrow to the southeast, the chalk downland stretching in all directions with its subtle texture of ploughed and unploughed ground, its shadow-revealed earthworks, its sense of density and intention. The landscape does not look natural. It looks managed, shaped, inscribed. It is the landscape of a culture that took the marking of the land with extraordinary seriousness, and that marking has never been entirely unmade. This is, in the end, the truest answer to why Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe. It is not a single cause, but a convergence. The geological diversity that provided materials, the island's geography that created a bounded competitive space, the Atlantic corridor that made Britain a nexus of cultural exchange, the specific cultural traditions of ancestor veneration and astronomical orientation that drove monument building for millennia, the landscape conditions that preserved what was built, the successive waves of new populations that adopted rather than destroyed the monuments they inherited, the tradition of sanctity that accumulated around specific sites and protected them from casual destruction, the density of settlement that ironically preserved rather than erased the ancient fabric. All of these things together, all of them operating across such a long time span that their cumulative effect dwarfs anything that could have been achieved by any single civilization in any single period. Britain is a palimpsest, a document written over and over on the same surface, with each new inscription overlaying, but not entirely erasing, what came before. And if you know how to read it, the oldest inscription is still visible beneath all the rest. So, written not in any language we can translate, but in the language of stone and earth and orientation and light, a language that was old before any human language we recognize was spoken. The dark reason is simply this. The builders understood impermanence. They built against it. They built hard enough and large enough and in sufficient numbers that their argument outlasted them. Not forever. Perhaps not even for very much longer, given the pace at which climate change is eroding coastlines and flooding lowlands and destabilizing the soil that has held these monuments for millennia. But for now, for this moment in history, their argument is still being made. 30,000 monuments still standing or still legible in the landscape, still orienting everyone who sees them toward the question they were built to ask. What are we? Where are we? What do we owe the dead? What will we leave for those who come after? These are not ancient questions. They are not questions that belong to people who lived 10,000 years ago and are no longer relevant. They are the questions that every human being who has ever lived has had to ask. The people who built the monuments asked them. The people who inherited the monuments without understanding them asked them. The people who are excavating the monuments now and trying to read what they say are asking them. And we, Lying in our beds, in the dark, listening to the story of those monuments, are asking them too. The monuments do not answer. They never answered. But they keep asking, 30,000 times. Let us move now to something specific. Let us go to a place that is not on the tourist trail, that does not appear in most books about British prehistory, and that presents some of the most difficult and least resolved questions in the entire field. Let us go to the chalk downlands of the Yorkshire Wolds. The Yorkshire Wolds are a gentle landscape. Rolling chalk hills, broad valleys, farmland that has been under the plough for centuries. Not the dramatic scenery of the Wiltshire Downlands or the stark beauty of the Orkney archipelago, but the wolds contain, per square mile, one of the highest densities of prehistoric burial monuments in Britain. The round barrows of the Bronze Age are here in their hundreds, some isolated, some in clusters, some in linear chains that follow ridgelines for miles. Many have been ploughed flat and survive only as crop marks that appear in dry summers, when the chalk pits beneath the topsoil retain moisture. Differently from the surrounding soil, many were excavated in the 19th century by antiquaries who did not have the methodological sophistication of modern archaeology and published accounts that raise more questions than they answer. But there is something about the wolds that goes beyond the barrows. In certain valleys, and along certain ridgelines, the landscape shows signs of having been deliberately modified at a scale and with a consistency that suggests something more than individual monument-building communities making independent decisions. The field systems, the trackways, the enclosures, the relationship between the burial monuments and the agricultural landscape all suggest that the wolds were managed as a unified region during the Bronze Age, with a coordination that implies some form of governance or authority operating at a regional level. This is speculative. The evidence for regional level organization in Bronze Age Britain is fragmentary and contested. But the alternative, that thousands of individual communities made thousands of independent decisions that happened to produce a coherent regional pattern, seems statistically improbable. Something was organizing the Bronze Age landscape of the Yorkshire Wolds. Something was making decisions about where the barrows went, where the field boundaries ran, where the trackways led, on a scale that exceeded the capacity of individual village communities. Who was that something? We do not know. The Bronze Age in Britain left no written records. We have no names, no titles, no descriptions of social organization, beyond what can be inferred from the material culture in the graves and settlements. But the graves themselves are informative. Some Bronze Age barrows in the wolds contain burials of extraordinary richness, individuals interred with gold ornaments and amber necklaces and bronze daggers and pots of what may have been food or drink for the afterlife. These are not ordinary people. These are people whose death was marked by the community with a level of conspicuous expenditure that speaks of significant social inequality. They were important in life. Their deaths were marked as important. Their graves were made permanent. Other barrows contain much simpler burials. A person, perhaps a pot, perhaps a few personal items, a flint tool, or a bronze pin. These are ordinary people. Their graves are smaller. Their grave goods are less elaborate. But they still got a barrow. They still got a permanent monument marking their presence in the landscape. That is significant. In many pre-modern societies, monumental burial is reserved for elites. The fact that Bronze Age Britain provided permanent burial monuments for a much wider range of the population, though clearly not everyone, suggests a social system in which monumental burial was accessible to more than just the very top of the hierarchy. This has implications for the numbers. If permanent burial was restricted to a narrow elite, the number of barrows you would expect over a given time period would be relatively small. If permanent burial was accessible to a substantial portion of the population, the number of barrows would be much larger. The Yorkshire Wolds barrows, which number in the hundreds in that one relatively small area, suggest that permanent burial was a common enough practice that communities were building new barrows at a rate of perhaps several per generation. Multiply that across all of Bronze Age Britain and across the several centuries of the main barrow building period, and you get a number that is staggering. Archaeologists estimate that there may be as many as 40,000 surviving Bronze Age round barrows in England alone, with more beneath ploughland and in areas that have been less thoroughly surveyed. 40,000 individual burial monuments, each one representing a construction project that required the labour of a significant number of people over perhaps several days or weeks. The sheer quantity of labour invested in Bronze Age burial is extraordinary. It dwarfs the labour invested in the famous Henge monuments, and yet receives much less attention, perhaps because individual round barrows are less visually spectacular than Stonehenge, perhaps because their numbers make them feel ordinary in a way that the great Henges do not. But ordinary in quantity does not mean ordinary in significance. 40,000 barrows across one country over approximately 1,000 years represents a sustained, society-wide commitment to permanent burial that has no parallel in European prehistory. The closest equivalents are in the Middle East and Egypt, where burial pyramid traditions developed independently and for different reasons in different cultural contexts. In Europe, the British and Irish round barrow tradition stands alone in its scale and duration. Why? Part of the answer is continuity. The round barrow tradition was not invented from scratch. It built on the long barrow tradition of the Neolithic, which was itself an expression of the ancestor veneration practices that seem to have been fundamental to the worldview of the early farming communities. The Neolithic long barrows were communal tombs, used over long periods to house the bones of the community's dead. When the culture shifted, when new populations arrived and new practices became dominant, the tradition of permanent burial for the important dead continued but in a modified form. Instead of communal, multi-period tombs, Bronze Age communities buried individuals under individual mounds. The form changed, the commitment to permanent burial did not. This continuity matters. It suggests that whatever deep cultural logic drove the British tradition of monumental burial was robust enough to survive major population change and cultural transformation. The specific practices changed. The underlying imperative to mark the death of important individuals in a way that was permanent and visible persisted. This is the kind of cultural continuity that does not require genetic or linguistic continuity. It can be transmitted even when the people transmitting it are largely replaced by newcomers. The newcomers saw the existing monuments. They saw that the people they were absorbing or displacing honored their dead with permanent structures. They adopted the practice, adapting it to their own cultural idiom. This is cultural osmosis. The monuments survived the people who built them and then shaped the people who inherited them. The Bronze Age newcomers did not arrive in Britain and decide to build barrows because their own cultural tradition required it. Their own continental tradition was actually somewhat different, characterized by pit burials and occasionally by wooden burial structures. They built barrows in Britain because they arrived in a landscape saturated with barrows and were influenced, consciously or not, by the monumental logic that landscape embodied. The monuments made more monuments. This is perhaps the most startling insight the British prehistoric record offers. The act of building a monument creates a model that future builders follow. A landscape full of monuments encourages more monument building, not just through social competition, but through aesthetic and cultural absorption. When you grow up in a landscape where every significant hill has a burial mound on it, you understand instinctively that building a burial mound on a hill is what you do with the dead. You do not have to be taught it explicitly. The landscape teaches it. Britain's extraordinary density of ancient monuments is thus partly self-generating. Each generation of monuments created the conditions for the next generation of monuments. The landscape accumulated its ruins through a feedback loop that operated across thousands of years. each new addition to the monumental landscape reinforcing the culture of monument building that would produce the next addition. And then it stopped. Not abruptly, but gradually, the tradition of monumental construction in prehistoric Britain wound down over the course of the first millennium BC. The hill forts of the Iron Age represent a different kind of monumentality, functional and defensive, rather than mortuary and astronomical. The cremation burials of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age are rarely accompanied by large visible mounds. The landscape of monuments stopped growing, and what was there began the long, slow process of being incorporated into a landscape that was changing in ways that would eventually produce the Britain we recognize. The Roman conquest brought roads and towns and villas and entirely new categories of monument. The post-Roman period brought the construction of churches, first wooden, then increasingly stone, often on the sites of pre-Roman or Roman sacred places. The medieval period built castles and monasteries and cathedrals and market towns. The agricultural revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries dramatically changed the rural landscape, destroying thousands of monuments through ploughing, even as antiquarians were beginning to recognize the importance of what remained. The Industrial Revolution created an entirely new kind of monument, the factory and the mine and the railway viaduct, which are now themselves becoming the subject of heritage protection as they age beyond living memory. Every period left its ruins. Britain's landscape is a ruin landscape in its entirety, a place where every era has left its mark, and where the marks of every era persist in some form. The prehistoric period left the most marks because it lasted the longest. 10,000 years of monument building against 2,000 years of Roman and post-Roman and medieval and modern history combined. The prehistoric record is deep precisely because it is old, because the social logic that produced it operated across an enormous span of time, and because the landscape of Britain has been, for most of that time, unusually good at keeping what was placed on it. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe is the dark reason that any archive exists. Something was lost. Something needed to be preserved because it would otherwise be gone. The monuments are the response to impermanence, the human refusal to accept that what happens leaves no trace. The people who built them understood, in the most visceral way possible, how easily everything can be lost. They had watched their own dead disappear into the earth. They had seen the settlements of previous peoples return to grassland. They had known the anxiety of a world without writing, without recording, without any mechanism for preserving what mattered, beyond the fallible memories of living people. So they built, and what they built has lasted longer than anything else they might have done to preserve themselves. Their languages are gone, their religion is gone, their social structure is gone, their agricultural practices are gone, their names are gone, but their stones are still here, their earthworks are still here. Their intention is still legible in the landscape, even if its specific content has been lost. This is the monument's victory over time, and it is a genuine victory. 10,000 years is a long time. To be remembered, even without a name, even without a language, even without a specific belief attributed to you, even as simply the people who built that structure on that hill, in that particular orientation, in that specific period, is more than most human beings across most of history have managed. The people who built the British monuments survived as structures, as patterns in the earth, as alignments with the sun and moon. They will survive that way for a while longer yet, until the sea takes them, or the plough, or the developer's machine, or the slow chemistry of acid rain and warming temperatures, or until someone builds a monument to them, which is, in a sense, what we are doing here. There is a question buried inside all of this that most treatments of British prehistory do not ask directly. Why do we find this fascinating? Why, of all the things that could occupy the human mind in the 21st century, Does the idea of ancient ruins, ancient monuments, ancient peoples who left no writing and no remembered names exert such a powerful pull on our attention? Why are we here, in the dark, with this question? The answer, I think, is the same answer the monuments themselves give. We are trying to understand where we came from. We are trying to locate ourselves in a narrative long enough to contain us. We know, in the abstract, that human beings have been doing human things for a very long time. We know that we are not the first. We know that there were people before us who looked at the same stars and wondered about the same things and felt the same mix of wonder and terror at the fact of being alive in a universe that does not explain itself. The monuments make that knowledge concrete. They turn the abstract into something you can touch, something you can stand inside of, or next to, or on top of, and feel the physical weight of all that time pressing down and up and sideways from every direction. The British prehistoric monuments are, among other things, a cure for the illusion of novelty. They cure the feeling that we are the first people to have felt what we feel, to have asked what we ask, to have built what we build. Standing inside the ring of Brodgar on a winter evening as the light fails over Hoy and the stones become silhouettes against a sky that has not changed since they were raised, it is impossible to maintain the comfortable modern illusion that we are different from the people who came before. We are not. We are them. We are made of the same evolutionary material, running the same basic operating system, asking the same questions with the same inadequate tools. The monument does not make us humble, it makes us accurate. And accuracy, in a world full of flattering mirrors, is a kind of dark gift. The ruins also ask something of us. They ask whether we will leave something comparably permanent, whether there will be anything in 3,000 years that speaks for this moment in the same way that the standing stones speak for theirs. It is a question that is getting more pressing, not less, as climate change reshapes the coastlines and acidifies the oceans and makes the long-term future of human civilization uncertain in ways that would have been completely familiar to a Neolithic farmer watching a succession of bad harvests and wondering whether the world was ending. They built through their uncertainty. They built, despite not knowing, whether the sun would return, or the crops would grow, or the ancestors would protect them. They built because building was the only rational response they had to a universe that was terrifying and beautiful and indifferent. They encoded their uncertainty in stone and made the encoding permanent, so that every generation that came after would know that their predecessors had also been uncertain, had also been afraid, had also reached for permanence in the face of impermanence, and had found in building a form of grace. Whether we have the same impulse remains to be seen. Whether what we build will survive as long remains to be seen. Whether the things we make to preserve knowledge will be readable in 3,000 years. Whether the formats and the infrastructure and the cultural context that makes them legible will persist is an open question. The stone circles have lasted. The digital record is fragile in ways that stone is not, dependent on hardware and software and power supplies and institutional continuity that the stones did not require. The monuments of the ancient world have outlasted every empire and every religion and every language that produced them. The monuments of our own moment may prove more fragile, more dependent on conditions of stability that we are actively undermining. This is the darkest thought that the British ruins invite, that we are not as good at permanence as the people who came before, that the monuments they built with such labour and such intention will outlast the data centres and the cloud storage and the social media archives that we trust to hold our memories. That in 3,000 years, the stones will still be standing and our record of ourselves will have been lost to power outages and format changes and the simple physical decay of the plastic and silicon we have made our civilization from. The stones do not care. They will still be there. The question is whether anyone will still be there to see them. Let us pull back from that precipice and return to something more concrete. Let us talk about what the ruins are actually teaching us in the present moment through the ongoing work of archaeology and archaeoastronomy and ancient DNA analysis and all the other tools that are currently being brought to bear on the British prehistoric record. Because what we are learning right now is extraordinary, not in a sensationalist way, in the quietly, persistently astonishing way that real knowledge accumulates. The ancient DNA revolution, which I mentioned earlier, is transforming our understanding of who the builders were and where they came from. But it is doing something more than simply mapping population movements. It is revealing the complexity of the social and genetic history of these islands in ways that complicate any simple narrative. The Neolithic farmers who arrived around 4000 BC were genetically distinct from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they encountered. The Yamnaya-related Bronze Age migrants who arrived around 2000 BC were genetically distinct from both earlier groups. These are real and significant transitions, but within each period there was already variation, already mixing, already a complexity of population that does not reduce to simple waves of replacement. The Neolithic population was not genetically uniform. Different regions of Britain show different genetic profiles, suggesting that the agricultural transition was not a single event, but a complex, multi-stage process involving multiple migrations and varying degrees of mixing with existing populations. The Bronze Age transition similarly shows variation, with some regions apparently experiencing more complete replacement and others showing greater continuity with the Neolithic population. The picture is not a sequence of replaced populations. It is a churning, mixing, adapting mosaic of populations at different stages of interaction across a landscape that was already richly inhabited. This has implications for the monuments. If the population was already genetically complex, already a mixture of long resident and recently arrived groups, then the social dynamics that drove monument building were correspondingly complex. Different communities had different ancestral claims. Different groups could trace different lengths of residence in specific landscapes. The competition for ancestral authority, for the right to claim that this territory belongs to us because our dead are here and have always been here, was not a competition between simple, ethnically uniform groups. It was a competition within a diverse, multi-origin society that was constantly negotiating its own composition. This is not so different from what happens today. Modern Britain is also a diverse, multi-origin society constantly negotiating its own composition. The question of whose ancestors are here, of who has the right to claim this landscape as their own, is not a question that disappeared with the prehistoric period. It has been asked and contested and partially answered in different ways in every generation. The monuments are one dimension of that contestation. They are the material expression of ancestral claims, and those claims have never stopped being made. The difference is that we can now see, through the lens of ancient DNA, that the claims have always been complicated. There was never a simple, pure founding population. There was never a moment when this island was inhabited by one people who could legitimately be called the original British. Britain has been a diverse, contested, multi-origin place for as long as it has been inhabited. The monuments are evidence of that complexity, not of a single culture's program, but of the overlapping, competing, negotiating aspirations of multiple communities across thousands of years. This is a more honest account of British prehistory than the nationalistic narratives that have sometimes been imposed on the archaeological record. It is also a more interesting one. The story of how Britain's ruined landscape came to be is not the story of one people's extraordinary achievement. It is the story of many peoples, over a very long time, all reaching for permanence in their own ways, all contributing to an accumulation that is greater than any of them could have intended or imagined. And it is still accumulating. New discoveries are being made every year. The drone and the LiDAR scanner and the high-resolution satellite image are finding new monuments in landscapes that have been studied for centuries. In 2020, a significant complex of late Neolithic pits was discovered near Durrington Walls, adjacent to Stonehenge. A circular arrangement of shafts dug into the chalk at intervals of about 10 meters, forming a ring nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. The shafts are deep and wide and show signs of having been deliberately maintained. Their purpose is unknown. Their scale is extraordinary. They were found not by excavation, but by geophysical survey and drilling, invisible from the surface, hidden in a landscape that has been studied more intensively than almost anywhere else in the world. If there are features this significant that have remained unknown in the most intensively studied prehistoric landscape in Britain, how many more are there elsewhere in the less intensively studied uplands and wetlands and coastal margins? The number 30,000 is provisional. It will grow. The archive is not closed. The conversation the monuments are having with us is not finished. This is, if anything, the most hopeful thing about the story of Britain's ancient ruins. The monuments outlasted the people who built them. The knowledge is not all lost. The pattern is still legible, at least in part, and the tools we are bringing to bear on reading it are improving faster than at any previous point in history. We are, in a very real sense, on the verge of being able to read the monuments more clearly than at any time since their construction. The ancient DNA tells us who built them. The LiDAR tells us what landscape they were built in relation to. The archaeoastronomical analysis tells us why they were oriented the way they were. The isotope analysis tells us where the builders came from and what they ate. The artifact analysis tells us what they made and traded and valued. We are slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely assembling a picture of prehistoric Britain that the builders themselves did not have. They knew their own moment. We can see the whole arc, and the arc is extraordinary. It begins in the deep time of human evolution, with footprints in mud at Happisburgh 900,000 years ago, and it runs through the arrival of modern humans after the Ice Age, through the agricultural Neolithic and the monument building tradition that erupted with such force and that left such permanent marks, through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Roman period and all the subsequent layers of culture and settlement and ruin, to here, to this moment, to this conversation in the dark about what it all means and why it still matters. It matters because the monuments are still there. It matters because they are still asking. It matters because the questions they ask about permanence and memory and the relationship between the living and the dead and the cosmos are not questions that any amount of technological sophistication has made irrelevant. It matters because we are not so different from the people who built them. And the evidence for that is precisely the fact that we find them so compelling, that we are drawn to them, that we lie awake thinking about them, that we make videos about them and listen to those videos in the dark. The monuments know something about us. They know that we want to be remembered. They know that we fear being forgotten. They know that we look at the stars and wonder. They know that we bury our dead and think about where they go. They know all of this because the people who built them were thinking about all of this when they set each stone and cut each ditch and oriented in each chamber toward each specific point on the horizon. And they knew we would come. Not us specifically, not in any prophetic sense, but they knew that people would come, that the future would happen, that there would be generations after them who would see what they had built. That was, in part, why they built it, so that those future people, standing in the circle, or at the barrow, or on the hill, Fort Rampart, would know that someone was here before, that someone tried, that someone cared enough about permanence to make something permanent. We know. We are here. 30,000 monuments, and we are still coming to see them, still standing inside them, still asking what they meant and why they lasted and what it means that they lasted while everything else is gone. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe is that the people who built them were very good at the one thing that matters in the long run. They were very good at leaving something behind. Let us think about one final thing before we close this story. Let us think about what it feels like to be inside one of these monuments at the moment that matters most. Imagine the winter solstice at Maeshowe, Orkney, the northernmost islands of Scotland, December 21st, the shortest day of the year. The sun rises at 9 in the morning and sets at 3 in the afternoon. 6 hours of weak winter light before the long darkness returns. The cairn at Maeshowe, built around 3000 BC, has been sealed for most of its 5,000-year history. The passage is narrow and low. You have to crouch to enter, walking through the stone-lined tunnel toward a central chamber that opens up to a height of nearly 5 meters. Corbelled stone walls rising to a dome that was still standing when the first Norse raiders broke in around 1,000 years ago and left their graffiti on the walls in runes. The Norse graffiti is itself extraordinary. 12th century Vikings sheltering in the Neolithic tomb during a winter storm, scratching their names and observations into the ancient walls. Many of these are the usual stuff of human self-assertion. Ingigerd is the most beautiful woman in the world. Thorny carved these runes. But one inscription is different. It says, in runes, that a large treasure was hidden north of this place. It is probably not true, but the fact that someone in the 12th century thought it worth saying suggests that Maeshowe was associated in the Norse imagination with something of great value, however imaginary. The Norse had been living among the Orkney monuments for centuries by the time of these inscriptions. The ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stennis were still standing, as they are now. The mounds and cairns that dotted the Orkney landscape were a constant presence. The Norse called Maeshowe Orkahauga, the mound of Orkney, as if it were the central monument of the island group, the thing that defined the landscape. They respected it, in their way. They broke into it, but they did not destroy it. They left their marks and moved on, and the cairn kept its shape and its alignment, waiting for the winter solstice to come again and do what it had been built to do. What it does is this. In the weeks around the winter solstice, the setting sun is low enough in the sky to send a beam of light directly down the passage of Maeshowe and into the central chamber. For about 25 minutes on the solstice and the days immediately surrounding it, a shaft of golden light moves across the floor of the chamber, illuminating the back wall. The effect is dramatic even in photographs. In person, by those who have experienced it, it is described as overwhelming. The darkness of the interior, which is absolute outside the brief solstice window, gives way to something sabatna that feels almost aggressive in its brightness. A beam of light in a space that has been dark for most of 5,000 years. This is why it was built. This is what 5,000 years of waiting looks like. The sun does what it has always done. The chamber does what it was built to do. And anyone inside the chamber in those 25 minutes is inside a machine that the Neolithic people of Orkney built to connect them with something larger than themselves. Something that has been happening since before the Earth existed and will keep happening after every human trace has returned to dust. You would stand in that light and you would not be alone. You would be standing with everyone who has ever stood in that light since the chamber was built. The Neolithic farmers who built it and gathered there on the darkest days of the year, who may have brought the bones of their dead to share in the illumination, who may have danced or sung or performed ceremonies we cannot recover, the people of the Bronze Age who inherited the landscape and continued to treat the ancient monuments with reverence even as they built their own, the Norse who broke in and sheltered there and carved their names on the walls, the 19th century antiquaries who first described the chamber and began to understand its astronomical function, the modern visitors who arrive in organized groups on the solstice, by lottery, because the demand to stand in that shaft of light far exceeds the chamber's capacity. All of them, across 5,000 years, all of them standing in the same place, watching the same light, connected by the same architecture to the same astronomical reality. This is what monuments do that nothing else can. They create a conversation across time, not through language, not through records, not through institutions that require maintenance and are vulnerable to political change and cultural forgetting. Through geometry, through the invariant relationship between a building and the sun. As long as the sun rises and sets in the way it always has, and as long as the building stands in the orientation its builders chose, the conversation continues. The beam of light enters the chamber, the back wall is illuminated, and whoever is standing there is, for those 25 minutes, in precisely the relationship to the sun and the earth and the passage of time that the Neolithic architects intended. This is the monument's greatest achievement, not permanence for its own sake, not the mere survival of stones across millennia, but the maintenance of a specific relationship, a specific moment of connection between human beings and the cosmos, across a span of time that makes all of recorded history look brief. 30,000 moments like this, 30,000 monuments, each one a specific relationship, frozen in stone and earth, waiting for the right moment, the right season, the right alignment to come around again and do what it was built to do. Britain is not a country with more ruins than anywhere else in Europe by accident. It is a country where the human need to make these moments of connection permanent was felt more intensely, sustained more consistently, and embodied more permanently than anywhere else. The dark reason is the human reason, the fear of being forgotten, the desire to be remembered, the need to leave something behind that says we were here and we knew things and we cared about what we knew and we wanted you, whoever you are, whenever you are, to know that we cared. We know. We are still here, inside the monuments they built, standing in the light they oriented toward us, asking the same questions they asked with the same insufficient tools, building the same inadequate structures against the same inevitable impermanence. The ruins are not dark because they are ruined. They are dark because they remind us of everything that is always being lost. Every generation, every individual, every accumulation of knowledge and love and intention that makes a human life, reduced eventually to a mark in the earth, a shadow in the crop, a beam of light entering a stone chamber on a winter morning. The dark reason is the reason we are all going to become ruins eventually. And the question the British prehistoric monuments ask, the question they have been asking for 10,000 years to anyone who would stand in them and listen, is whether we built anything worth the asking. The sun sets. The chamber goes dark. The stones stand in the cold. Tomorrow the sun will return, as it always has, as the builders always knew it would. That knowing, preserved in stone across 5,000 years, is the most extraordinary thing on this island. More extraordinary than any individual monument. More extraordinary than any single alignment or burial or sacred landscape. The knowing that the sun returns. The confidence to build against impermanence, because you understand that there are patterns in the world that are more permanent than any human life, and that encoding those patterns in stone is the closest thing to immortality that any of us will ever manage. The British ruins are 30,000 attempts at immortality, most of them nameless, all of them still trying, all of them still here, and that, more than any geological explanation or archaeological argument or sociological theory about competitive monument buildings and ancestor veneration, is the truest and darkest and most human reason that Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe. Because the people who built them refused to disappear quietly, and so far, at least, they have been right not to. The landscape holds them. The light still enters their chambers. The alignments still work. The geometry still speaks, and we are still listening, in the dark, just like this. There is one more layer to this story, one more dimension that most treatments of British prehistory leave largely unexplored because it requires sitting with an uncertainty that is genuinely uncomfortable. It requires asking not just what the monuments were for, but what the monuments did to the people who built them. Consider this. Building a monument is not a neutral act. It does not simply express a culture, it also shapes a culture. The act of organizing hundreds of people to move large stones across large distances, to cut ditches into chalk bedrock, to maintain a construction project across multiple generations, does something to the society that undertakes it. It creates roles and hierarchies and obligations that did not exist before. It creates specialists and subordinates. It creates the need for planning and storage and distribution of resources across time. It creates, in short, a more complex society than the one that existed before the building began. Monumental architecture is not just a product of social complexity. It is also a generator of social complexity. The great henge monuments of the Neolithic period did not simply reflect a society organized enough to build them. They helped create the society that built them by demanding levels of organization that required new forms of leadership, new mechanisms of resource allocation, new ways of binding people together across time and distance. The building of Stonehenge was not just an expression of whatever social structure existed in Wiltshire around 2500 BC. It was, to some extent, the social structure. The project was the institution. The construction was the government. This is an uncomfortable thought because it implies something about the nature of monuments that the tourist brochures do not typically acknowledge. Monuments are not just beautiful. They are also tools of power. They require labor, and they command labor, and the ability to command labor is the definition of political authority. The people who directed the building of the British prehistoric monuments were exercising political power over the people who did the building. Those people, the laborers, the carriers of stone, the diggers of ditches, may or may not have participated willingly. The evidence does not tell us clearly. The traditional interpretation is that the labor was willingly given, that monument building was a communal act of religious devotion, analogous to the building of medieval cathedrals, where people gave their labor freely because the project was sacred and their participation was itself a form of religious observance. This interpretation is comforting. It casts the Neolithic and Bronze Age builders as the original volunteers, donating their weekends to a community project of spiritual significance. But the analogy with medieval cathedrals is imperfect. The building of medieval cathedrals was managed by a highly organized institutional church with coercive power. The peasants who provided labor for cathedral building did not all do so entirely voluntarily. They did so within a social structure that compelled certain kinds of participation and made non-compliance costly. The idea that the labor for prehistoric monuments was purely voluntary, freely given by enthusiastic believers, with no element of obligation or coercion, may be a projection of our desire to see the past in a flattering light. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Analysis of the skeletal remains associated with the monument building periods does not show the signs of heavy, repetitive labor stress that you would expect to see in a population that was coerced into harsh working conditions. The bones of Neolithic British people are not the bones of a workforce ground down by forced labor. They are the bones of people who were active and healthy enough to do substantial physical work without it breaking their bodies in the ways that chronic forced labor does. This is consistent with willing participation, but it is also consistent with a labor system that was organized and probably obligatory, but was also seasonal, limited in duration, and provided its participants with food and drink and ceremony during the construction period. The evidence from Durrington walls a massive late Neolithic settlement adjacent to Stonehenge, suggest that large numbers of people gathered there seasonally, ate well, including large quantities of feasted cattle, and participated in a community event that combined labor with celebration. They were not slaves, but they were also not simply doing whatever they felt like. They were participating in a socially structured event with expectations attached to it. The dark implication is that the monuments, for all their beauty and their astronomical sophistication and their evidence of sophisticated knowledge, are also evidence of inequality. The people who directed the work and the people who did the work were not the same people. The knowledge holders who understood the astronomical alignments were not the people hauling the stones. The social structure that made monument building possible was not egalitarian, even if it was not simply oppressive. Power, in prehistoric Britain as everywhere else, was unequally distributed. The monuments are therefore not only celebrations of knowledge and expressions of cosmological belief and arguments for ancestral authority. They are also the most visible manifestations of social inequality in the archaeological record. The ability to mobilize hundreds of workers, to sustain a multi-generational construction project, to control the distribution of resources across time, these things require that some people have more authority than others. The monuments are evidence of hierarchy. They are the buildings that hierarchy made, and they are also the buildings that reinforced and perpetuated hierarchy by making it visible, physical, permanent. Every large prehistoric monument in Britain is, on one level, a power structure. Not just metaphorically, but literally. It is the physical expression of someone's ability to tell other people what to do and to have them do it. And the fact that 30,000 such power structures exist in Britain suggests that the capacity for that kind of authority was distributed more widely here than elsewhere, or that it was exercised more often, or that the social logic of monument building as an expression of power was so deeply embedded in successive British cultures that it persisted long after the specific cosmological reasons for building might have evolved. This is not a comfortable reading of the monuments, but it is an honest one. The great prehistoric structures of Britain were built by human beings, and human beings in organized societies have always been organized partly through relations of power that include inequality and obligation. To pretend otherwise, to see the monuments as the products of an egalitarian community of freely participating believers, is to impose a wish upon the evidence that the evidence does not support. What the evidence supports is something more complicated, a society that was unequal but not necessarily oppressive, a hierarchy that was organized around knowledge as much as force, a tradition of monumental construction that served multiple purposes simultaneously, that was both genuinely spiritually meaningful to the people who built it and also a mechanism for the display and reproduction of social authority. Both things at once. Not one or the other, both. This is true of most of the world's great monuments, the pyramids of Egypt, the cathedrals of medieval Europe, the temple complexes of Mesoamerica. They are simultaneously genuine expressions of belief and also instruments of power. The two are not in contradiction. They are, in fact, mutually reinforcing. Authority that can make its claims in cosmic terms, that can align itself with the sun and the dead and the forces that govern the universe, is more durable and more persuasive than authority that rests on force alone. The British prehistoric monuments were not built by saints or by slaves. They were built by people in all the complex reality that implies. And the monuments they built have outlasted every attempt to understand them simply. Let us go somewhere else in Britain now. Somewhere that raises a different set of questions about the relationship between the landscape and the people who shaped it. Let us go to the Somerset Levels. The Somerset Levels are a low-lying landscape in southwest England, a patchwork of wetland and reclaimed farmland between the Mendip Hills and the Quantocks. For much of the year, they are damp. For much of their history, they have been wet enough to preserve organic materials that would have decayed in drier environments, and what they have preserved is extraordinary. The Sweet Track is a timber walkway constructed from split planks of ash, oak, and lime, laid end to end along a raised surface of peat, extending for nearly 2 kilometers across what was then open water. It was built around 3800 BC, making it one of the oldest surviving engineered structures in Britain and one of the oldest roads in the world. The timbers have been precisely dated through dendrochronology, tree ring analysis, to the winter of 3806 to 3807 BC. We know within a single winter when this road was built. The Sweet Track was not a monument in the sense that Stonehenge is a monument. It was infrastructure. It was a practical walkway connecting dry land on either side of a waterlogged wetland. But its construction required the kind of planning and resource management and social organization that monument building required. The planks were carefully split from mature trees, transported to the building site, and laid with a precision that suggests the project was directed by someone who knew what they were doing. The wood was then maintained and, in some sections, replaced as the structure settled into the peat. Objects have been found deposited beside the Sweet Track that suggest it had a ritual dimension as well as a practical one. A jadeite axe, polished and unused, from a source in the Alps. A pottery vessel still containing hazelnuts and a wooden platform that may have been a small altar. The boundary between the practical and the ritual was apparently not clear to the people who used this road. Crossing the water was a significant act. The water was a boundary, and boundaries required acknowledgement. The track was infrastructure but also a threshold. This is characteristic of the prehistoric British approach to landscape. Nothing is purely practical. Everything carries meaning. The wetland is not just a physical obstacle to be overcome by engineering. It is also a liminal space between the dry world and whatever is below the water, and crossing it requires the recognition of that liminality through offerings and attention. The road and the ritual are not separate. They are the same thing. This double nature, the simultaneous practical and cosmological function of landscape features, appears everywhere in British prehistory. The causewayed enclosures that preceded the henge monuments served as gathering places for seasonal ceremonies, but they also served as sites for the exchange of goods and the management of herds. The hill forts of the Iron Age were defensive structures, but also centres of production, trade, and political authority. The barrows were burial monuments, but also territorial markers and meeting places for the communities that maintained them. In prehistoric Britain, nothing seems to have had a single function. Everything was also something else. This multiplicity of function may help explain the density of monuments. If every significant practical activity also had a ritual dimension, and if that ritual dimension required permanent marking in the landscape, then the number of monuments you would expect to see is much larger than if ritual and practical were clearly separated domains. The Sweet Track leaves traces not just because it was a road, but because it was also a liminal crossing and also a resource management structure and also a territorial marker and also, perhaps, a demonstration of the community's ability to build lasting things. All of these functions in a single structure, all of them contributing to the impulse to build something permanent. Multiply this across 30,000 sites, and you have the British prehistoric landscape. There is something else about the Somerset levels that I want to draw your attention to. The preservation of the organic material there, the timber tracks and the wooden tools and the food remains, and in some cases the remains of human activity, in remarkable detail, offers a window into the daily life of prehistoric Britain that the stone monuments do not. The monuments show us the extraordinary. The bog deposits show us the ordinary. The ordinary, it turns out, was not so different from what you might imagine. People ate, they cooked, They used tools that required regular maintenance. They traveled across their landscape to gather resources and to trade and to meet other people. They made things from the materials available to them with a skill and creativity that is genuinely impressive. The wooden bowls and the woven textiles and the carefully carved implements that have survived in the peat are not the products of a primitive technology. They are the products of a mature, confident, highly skilled craft tradition that had been refined across thousands of years. The people who built Stonehenge also made beautiful bowls. The people who raised the hill forts also wove intricate textiles. The people who aligned their burial chambers with the winter solstice also cooked elaborate meals and traded across distances that required sophisticated knowledge of geography and social networks. They were not defined by their monuments. The monuments were one dimension of a complete, complex human life that included all the ordinary things that human lives always include. This is worth saying because the monuments can distort our perception. They make the prehistoric past look like a place where people did nothing but build and bury and perform ceremonies. They are the survivals. The evidence of ordinary life, being organic and therefore fragile, mostly did not survive. The stone and the earth remained. The wood and the food and the clothing and the conversation and the laughter and the everyday texture of human experience mostly did not. What we have is a sample biased toward the permanent, and permanent things tend to be the exceptional things, the things that communities invested in specifically because they wanted them to last. Knowing this, we should hold the monuments with a slightly different kind of attention. They are not the whole picture. They are the part of the picture that survived, and the people who created them were not primarily monument builders. They were people who sometimes, when it was necessary and meaningful, built monuments. The rest of the time they were farmers and hunters and craftspeople and parents and lovers and storytellers and ordinary human beings, living in the same complicated, contradictory, joyful, terrifying reality that all human beings inhabit. The dark reason Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe is partly, then, a sampling bias. We see more here, not only because more survived, but because we are seeing through a filter that selects for the permanent, and the British tradition of monument building was unusually productive of permanent things. The ordinary life of prehistoric Britain was probably not so different from the ordinary life of prehistoric France or Germany. But the French and the Germans did not build quite so many permanent things, and so the ordinary life of prehistoric France and Germany is correspondingly harder to see past and into. Britain's ruins are a kind of optics. They magnify certain aspects of the past and obscure others. What they magnify is the desire for permanence. What they obscure is everything that was also happening, all the ordinary human activity that left no permanent mark. To understand prehistoric Britain fully, you have to hold both in mind simultaneously: the great stone monuments and the vanished daily life, the extraordinary and the ordinary, the permanent and the lost. Let us talk now about endings, because the story of why Britain has more ancient ruins than any country in Europe is not only a story about building, it is also a story about what happens when building stops, when a tradition that has sustained itself for thousands of years begins to fade, and what that fading can tell us about the nature of the tradition. The great period of prehistoric monument building in Britain did not end with a bang. It did not end with a conquest or a catastrophe or a sudden cultural revolution. It ended with a gradual shift in the relationship between communities and the landscape, a shift that was probably not experienced as an ending at all by the people living through it, but which, viewed from the perspective of several millennia, looks like a closing chapter. The Iron Age in Britain, roughly 700 BC to 43 AD, was a period of enormous activity, of population growth and agricultural intensification and social complexity and artistic achievement. The metalwork of the British Iron Age the torques and mirrors and shield bosses that have survived in museum collections around the world, represents some of the finest decorative art produced in prehistoric Europe. The social organization of the British Iron Age was sophisticated enough to produce the proto-urban settlements called oppida in the period just before the Roman conquest, large enclosed sites that functioned as centers of production, trade, and political authority. But the Iron Age did not build monuments in the same way that the Neolithic and Bronze Age had built them. The hill forts were indeed enormous constructions, and they are, in a sense, the monuments of the Iron Age, but they are functional structures, built primarily for defense and settlement, rather than for ritual and astronomical orientation. The tradition of building specifically to mark the relationship between the living and the dead and the cosmos had faded. Burial rites changed, becoming less monumental and more private. The great communal ceremonies that had animated the henge monuments were replaced by different forms of religious practice, centered perhaps more on sacred groves and rivers and springs than on purpose-built stone and earth enclosures. Why did the tradition change? Part of the answer is the population growth that came with agricultural intensification. A landscape that had supported small, dispersed communities in the Neolithic period was now supporting a much larger population with more complex and competing territorial claims. The land that had been available for monument building was increasingly needed for farming. The labor that had gone into construction was increasingly needed for agriculture. The balance shifted from investment in the ritual landscape to investment in the productive landscape. Part of the answer may also be cosmological. The religious traditions that had driven monument building were gradually replaced by different traditions. The ancestor cult of the Neolithic, with its emphasis on housing the dead in permanent structures and maintaining an ongoing relationship with them, seems to have given way to a different understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead. Cremation became increasingly common, and with cremation came a different relationship to the physical remains of the dead. You cannot maintain an ancestor's bones in a chamber if those bones have been burned to ash. The materiality of the dead changed, and with it, the need for permanent housing for the dead. This is not to say that ancestor veneration disappeared. The Roman and medieval periods in Britain both show evidence of continued interest in the ancestral past, of a relationship with the deep time of the island's history that was mediated partly through the visible monuments of that past. But the form of ancestor veneration changed. It became more symbolic and less material. The ruins were revered, but not built upon. They were inherited, but not extended. The tradition of building for the dead ended, but the ruins remained. And the ruins, as we have seen, kept being valued and preserved and incorporated into subsequent cultures' understanding of themselves and their landscape, even when the specific meaning of the ruins had been lost. This is the final dark wisdom of the British ruins. Things can outlast their meaning. The form can persist after the content has gone. The stone circle can remain aligned with the midsummer sunrise long after anyone remembers why it was aligned that way. The burial chamber can continue to admit its shaft of midwinter light, long after the belief that the light mattered for the dead has been replaced by something else entirely. The hill fort rampart can remain visible in the landscape, long after the society that built it has dissolved into the substrate of everything that came after. The form outlasts the content, and the form, simply by existing, continues to generate meaning, even if the new meaning is different from the original. Each generation that stands inside a stone circle and feels something it cannot name is not feeling what the Neolithic farmers felt when they built it. They are feeling something new, something generated by the combination of an ancient structure and a modern sensibility, a meaning that neither the builders nor we could have anticipated, but which is real nonetheless. The ruins are not finished. They keep becoming. They keep meaning things they were not originally built to mean. And in this ongoing generation of new meaning from old forms, They demonstrate the most extraordinary quality that any human creation can possess: resilience, the capacity to remain relevant, to keep speaking, to keep asking, to keep connecting across the incomprehensible span of time that separates us from the people who first placed each stone. Britain is full of things that are still becoming, still being discovered, still generating new meanings, still illuminating, literally in some cases, the faces of people who stand inside them on the right day of the year and look toward the back wall as the light enters. 30,000 of them, each one still trying, each one still here, in the dark of wherever you are right now, in the quiet of the night, in the particular combination of tiredness and curiosity, and something a little like awe that brought you to this story. You are connected to every person who has ever stood in a British monument and wondered. Every antiquary who measured a stone circle with a theodolite. Every farmer who ploughed around a barrow out of some instinctive respect they could not have articulated. Every Roman soldier who crossed a prehistoric earthwork on his way to a frontier, posting and noticed, without quite knowing what he was noticing, that the land had been shaped by human intention long before Rome existed. Every Bronze Age person who built their own small barrow beside the much larger one, left by their predecessors, adding their own argument to the ongoing argument of the landscape. All of them in the same conversation. All of them asking the same questions. All of them, in one way or another, still here. The ruins are not the past. They are the past that refused to become past. They are the part of the human story that insisted on remaining present, on continuing to speak, on keeping a seat at the table of every era that came after their builders were gone. And they will keep speaking, long after we are gone, long after our own ruins have been added to the British total. Whatever comes after us will walk among the stones, and the earthworks, and the hill, fort ramparts, and the chamber tombs, and the ancient field systems, and the Bronze Age barrows, and the stone circles, and all 30,000 of the monuments that accumulated on this island across 10,000 years of human need, and human ingenuity, and human fear, and human hope. And they will wonder what we were asking. The answer, as the ruins themselves demonstrate, is the same thing they were always asking. What are we? Where are we? What do we leave behind? And will it be enough to be remembered? The stones say yes. The light says yes. The long dark of the British winter says yes, and so does the midwinter dawn. We were here. We tried. We built. And the ruins prove it. 30,000 times over. 30,000 reasons to keep asking. And one answer that never changes. You are not the first. You will not be the last. And whatever you build it to last. Because the builders of Britain's ruins built to last, and they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Their names are gone. Their language is gone. Their religion is gone. Their social structure is gone. But their stones are still here. Their earthworks are still here. Their alignments still work, year after year, sunrise after sunrise, shaft of winter light after shaft of winter light entering the same chamber that was built to receive it 5,000 years ago. This is the monument's gift, the gift of duration, the gift of insisting, in the most physical and permanent way available to human beings, that we existed, that we knew things, that we cared about what we knew, and that we wanted you to know that we cared. The stones know something about you. They know that you need this. They know that lying in the dark, listening to a story about ancient ruins is not a strange way to spend an evening, but a profoundly human one. They know because they were built by people who also lay in the dark, wondering about what came before them and what would come after. They were built by people who were afraid of being forgotten and who were right to be afraid and who built, despite the fear, something that has not yet been forgotten. They made their argument in stone. And the stone is still speaking, in the dark, to you, right now. Let us end where many stories of ancient Britain end, not with the monuments, but with the landscape around them. In the hours just before dawn, when the light has not yet returned, and the stones are shadows against a sky that is beginning, very slowly, to consider becoming something other than dark. This is the hour that the builders of the monuments knew best, the hour before the promised return, the hour when you have watched all night, and the fire is low and the cold is deepest, and you cannot yet see whether the day will come. They knew this hour intimately, because they had aligned their buildings toward it. The passage tomb faces east. The stone circle has its axis pointing toward the horizon, where the sun will rise. The orientation is not toward the sun, but toward the moment before the sun, toward the darkness that the sun is about to end. In that orientation, there is a kind of faith, a belief accumulated through careful observation across many generations that the sun will come, that it has always come, that the pattern holds, that the universe, despite its apparent indifference, does in fact operate according to rules that can be known and counted on. The alignment of the monument toward the pre-dawn east is an act of trust. We built this facing that direction because we know, as surely as we know anything, that the light will come from there. This is the oldest form of science, the systematic observation of recurring patterns in the natural world and the encoding of those patterns in permanent form so that the knowledge is not lost when the individual observer dies. The British monuments are the oldest science labs we have. Their experiments are still running. The light still enters the passages and chambers at the expected moments. The hypothesis that the sun will rise over the heelstone at Stonehenge on the midsummer morning has been confirmed every year for 5,000 years. We are the inheritors of that experiment, not because we descend from the people who designed it, though some of us may carry traces of their genetics, but because we are the people who are here now, on this planet, asking the same fundamental questions they asked, using the same fundamental faculty they used, the capacity for sustained attention to the world, for pattern recognition across time, for the encoding of pattern in permanent form. The monuments were built by people who were paying attention. This is, in the end, the truest reason Britain has 30,000 ancient ruins. The people who built them were paying very close attention to their world, to its patterns and its requirements, and its threats and its beauties. And when you pay that kind of attention, you build things. You build them to embody what you noticed. You build them so that the noticing will not be lost. You build them because the act of building is itself a form of sustained attention, a way of being fully present to the world and to your moment in it. Pay attention. Build what you notice. Leave something behind that embodies your noticing. 30,000 monuments say this is possible. 30,000 monuments say that if you pay attention carefully enough, for long enough, with enough commitment, what you notice can outlast you by thousands of years. The dawn is coming. It is always coming. The stones know this and point toward it. All we have to do is look where they are pointing and pay attention, and maybe, if we are lucky, if we choose our materials carefully and our alignments truly and our intentions clearly, something of what we noticed will still be standing. When the people who come after us stand in the light of a winter solstice morning and wonder who we were and what we were trying to say. The answer is already encoded in the ruins. The same answer that every monument in Britain has always given. We were here, we were paying attention, and we built something so that you would know it. That is the beginning and the end of the story. That is the dark reason, and the hopeful one, both at once. Like the light entering the chamber, like the shadow retreating before the dawn, like the sun returning, as it always has, as it always will, for now. There are things about Britain's ancient landscape that do not fit neatly into any of the explanations we have been building across this conversation. Things that the archaeologists note in their field reports with the kind of careful, qualified language that means we have no idea what is happening here, but we are not going to say that directly. Things that require you to set aside the comfortable frameworks and sit with genuine uncertainty. Take the phenomenon known as phantom monuments. Across Britain, there are hundreds of sites that appear in historical records, in medieval documents or early modern survey notes or Victorian antiquarian accounts that describe stone circles or standing stones or earthworks that no longer exist. Some of these are explicable. The monument was destroyed by agriculture or road building or development in the intervening centuries. But some of them cannot be found because there is no evidence that they ever existed in the physical sense, not in the geological record, not in the soil chemistry, not in any trace that excavation or geophysical survey can detect. And yet, the descriptions are too specific to be simple fantasy, too detailed, too consistent with accounts from multiple independent observers in different periods. Places that were described by multiple people across multiple centuries as having stones or a circle or an earthwork, and yet, when you go looking, there is nothing. The orthodox explanation is destruction, that the monument was so thoroughly removed that no trace survives. This is possible, it happens, but in some cases the level of destruction required would have been so complete and so recent that it strains credulity, and the soil chemistry that should reveal disturbed ground shows nothing. A smaller number of researchers have proposed something more interesting, that some of the phantom monuments were never physical structures at all, but were instead landscape features whose significance was cultural and perceptual rather than architectural. Sacred places that required no physical marking because the people who knew them simply knew them. A particular hilltop, a specific spring, a place where two valley systems meet in a configuration that people understood as significant, but which required no construction to be experienced as such. These places may have been real in the most important sense, genuinely experienced as sacred or significant by the communities who knew them, without ever having been marked with stone or earth. They were monuments of attention rather than monuments of construction, and they left no trace because attention, for all its intensity, leaves no physical mark. The idea that some sacred places require no physical monument is not unusual across human cultures. Many indigenous traditions around the world maintain relationships with specific landscape features, specific hills or rivers or rock formations that are considered sacred without any construction having been added. The sacredness is in the perception, not in the stone. And when the tradition that maintains the perception ends, the place reverts to being simply a hill, simply a river, simply a rock. The monument of attention dissolves when the attention ends. Britain may have had many more such places than we know. The 30,000 physical monuments may be only the fraction of Britain's sacred landscape that was encoded in stone and earth rather than in memory and practice. The total number of places that were known and named and considered significant by the people who inhabited this landscape across 10,000 years is unknowable. It is certainly very large. And the loss of that knowledge, the dissolution of those monuments of attention, when the cultures that maintained them were replaced, is itself a kind of ruin. The invisible ruins, the places that mattered without leaving a mark. They are everywhere and nowhere, the largest and least recoverable part of Britain's ancient heritage, and they are a reminder that the 30,000 physical monuments we can count are not the whole story, but only the part that was heavy enough to stay. There is another category of the strange and unresolved that I want to spend some time with. The question of what the monuments sounded like. This may seem odd. Monuments are visual things. We look at them, we photograph them, we measure them and orient them and analyze their construction. Sound seems irrelevant, but there is a growing body of research suggesting that the acoustic properties of prehistoric monuments were not accidental. that the builders paid attention not just to how their structures would look, but to how they would sound, and that the experience of sound within a stone circle or burial chamber was an integral part of the experience those structures were designed to provide. The stone circle has unusual acoustic properties. The arrangement of stones in a circle creates reflections and resonances that affect how sound behaves within the space. Certain frequencies are amplified, others are dampened. The standing waves that form within a circle of standing stones are different from those that form in the open landscape around them. Someone speaking or chanting or drumming inside a stone circle would experience the sound of their own voice returning to them in ways that would not happen in open space. Research at Stonehenge, using acoustic models built to the monument's original proportions, has suggested that the completed stone circle created a strongly reverberant interior acoustic environment, one that would have made voices and musical instruments sound dramatically different than they did outside. The reverb time within the completed monument was apparently around 1 second, giving speech and music a richness and resonance that the open landscape could not provide. This was not accidental. The specific dimensions of the monument, the spacing of the stones, the height of the lintels, all of these parameters affect the acoustic outcome and were chosen by builders who, whatever else they were doing, were also creating a specific sonic environment. This has implications for how we understand the ceremonies that took place within these monuments. If the acoustic properties were intentional, then those ceremonies were sonic experiences as well as visual ones. The participants heard, not just saw. They experienced the resonance of their own voices returning to them as if the stones themselves were speaking. They heard instruments sounding different inside the circle than outside it. They experienced, in short, an immersive, multi-sensory environment that was carefully designed to produce specific effects. This is sophisticated. This is more sophisticated in some ways than what we typically attribute to Neolithic builders. The design of a space to produce specific acoustic properties requires knowledge of acoustics, even if that knowledge was empirical and experiential rather than theoretical. Someone who built stone circles understood, from experience, that stones arranged in specific configurations produce specific sounds. And they used that knowledge. The burial chambers are even more acoustically interesting. The corbelled chambers of passage tombs, with their specific proportions and their enclosed spaces, create acoustic environments that in some cases produce strong resonances at frequencies in the bass range, below 100 Hz, the range associated with drumming and with the low voices of chanting. Research in the chamber at Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire found that the space resonates at around 110 Hz, a frequency that corresponds approximately to the bass voice range. The chamber amplifies bass sounds in ways that would make any bass range vocal or percussion performance inside it sound dramatically louder and more present than it would in the open. Was this intentional? Was the chamber designed to be a resonant bass chamber? It is possible. It is also possible that it is a coincidence of geometry, that chambers built to specific practical specifications for housing ink. The dead happen to have these acoustic properties, but in the context of a tradition in which astronomical orientation was demonstrably intentional and in which everything appears to carry meaning, the acoustic properties are hard to dismiss as simply incidental. The people who built these monuments lived in a world without recorded sound, without instruments that could preserve sound across time, without any way of knowing what a ceremony sounded like a generation ago except through memory and practice. In that world, the acoustic properties of a space were part of its spiritual character. A space that made your voice resonate in an unusual way was a space where something was happening, where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary was thin. The acoustic chamber was a space where the ordinary rules of sound were suspended, where your voice came back to you amplified and transformed, where the relationship between speaker and space was different from anything in ordinary life. This is the experience of transcendence, and it was built in. The builders built transcendence into their monuments, not just through visual and astronomical effects, but through acoustic ones. The complete experience of a prehistoric British monument in its original form and context was probably overwhelming in ways that we cannot fully reconstruct, but can begin to imagine. Imagine being inside my show on the winter solstice as the shaft of light crosses the floor. Imagine hearing, simultaneously, the resonance of chanting voices amplified by the corbelled dome. Imagine the smell of burning torch resin and the cold of the stone and the warmth of the bodies crowded into the chamber around you. Imagine knowing, because you have been told since childhood, that this is the moment when the dead can hear the living and the living can feel the presence of the dead, and that the bones of your ancestors are here in this chamber with you, and that the light entering now is the sun returning from its farthest point, beginning the long journey back toward warmth and growing things, and that the ceremony you are performing right now, the chanting and the drumming and the offerings and the presence of the living in the house of the dead at the turning of the year is what keeps the sun returning. You would not be watching a light show. You would be doing something that mattered, something that the community depended on, something that only you and the others who knew the right words and the right movements and the right relationship between the living and the dead and the cosmos could do. You would be doing the most important thing in the world, and the monument would be amplifying everything: the sound of your voice, the shaft of light on the back wall, the closeness of the dead, the reality of the moment. This is what was lost when the tradition ended. Not the monument survived, but the full experience of the monument, the acoustic ceremony within it, and the cosmological belief surrounding it, and the social authority it embodied, and the specific relationship with the dead it maintained. All of that is gone. We have the shell. We do not have the life that once animated it. This is the most profound form of ruin. Not the physical ruin of a collapsed structure, but the experiential ruin of a context without which the structure cannot be fully understood. The monument stands. The experience that it was built to create does not. We can reconstruct parts of it, the astronomical alignments, the acoustic properties, the probable sequence of ceremonies through the analysis of artifacts and animal bones and plant remains. But we cannot reassemble the whole. The knowledge is too fragmented. The tradition is too long broken. What remains is what always remains when the content of a monument is lost: the form. And the form is beautiful and eerie and sometimes genuinely overwhelming in ways that suggest the designers understood something about human experience that our current frameworks for understanding architecture and space do not fully capture. The form continues to produce effects on people who visit these sites, effects that the visitors themselves often describe with words like sacred, or haunted, or overwhelming, or moving, words that cluster around a category of experience that does not reduce easily to the rational and the explicable. The monuments produce these effects not because they are mystical in any supernatural sense, but because they were designed by people who understood human sensory and emotional experience with extraordinary sophistication, and who encoded that understanding in the geometry and the orientation and the materiality and the acoustic properties of what they built. The monuments work on people because they were built to work on people. The effect is engineered, and the engineering still functions. 30,000 pieces of engineering that still function. 30,000 dark and beautiful reasons why this island carries more of the past than any other in Europe. The conversation between the ancient builders and everyone who has come since has never stopped. It continues every time someone walks into a stone circle and feels something they cannot name. Every time a farmer plows around a barrow because it feels wrong to plow through it. Every time an archaeologist carefully excavates a site and the ground gives up something that no one expected. Every time a tourist stands inside Stonehenge on the summer solstice and for just a moment stops thinking about the ticket price and the crowds and the cordon and simply looks at the stones against the sky and understands, in a way that does not require articulation, why people have been coming here for 5,000 years. The conversation continues, and the stones are patient. They have been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. They can wait a little longer. For the dawn, for the light, for you. The night is deepening. The landscape is still. And there is one more thing worth saying before the dark gives way to whatever comes next. Britain's ruins are not just about Britain. The tradition that produced them, the long human struggle to make something permanent in a world of impermanence, to encode knowledge in forms that will outlast the individuals who hold it, to mark the relationship between communities and the cosmos in ways that can be visited and verified and experienced again and again across generations. This tradition is not uniquely British. It is human. It is what human beings do when they have time and knowledge and the social structures to organize themselves towards something larger than individual survival. What is unique to Britain is the density and the duration. The long accumulation of monuments across such an extended span of time, driven by the particular combination of factors we have been exploring, the geology, the geography, the specific cultural traditions that took root here and were sustained here longer and more intensively than anywhere else in Europe. But the impulse behind every one of those 30,000 monuments is not British, it is universal, which means that the ruins speak to everyone who encounters them, not just to the descendants of the people who built them, not just to people with British ancestry or any particular cultural heritage. They speak to the human animal, to the part of every person that has ever looked at the stars and wondered, that has ever buried someone they loved and not known what to believe about where that person went, that has ever felt the particular terror of impermanence and responded with the particular human impulse to build something that will last. You are that animal, wherever you are right now, whatever the time is, whatever the landscape outside your window looks like. You share with the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge and the Bronze Age communities who raised their barrows and the Iron Age people who cut their hill forts into the hillsides, the same fundamental orientation toward the world. You are a being that needs meaning, a being that makes things, a being that, in the face of impermanence, builds. The 30,000 monuments of Britain are evidence that this impulse, this need, this particular expression of what it means to be human is old, older than writing, older than cities, older than anything we typically include in the official beginning of civilization. It goes back to before history, as we record it, before language as we write it, into the deep time when people were people in every meaningful sense, but had not yet invented the tools we now associate with being civilized. They were already fully human, already asking the questions, already building the answers. And their answers are still there, 30,000 of them, waiting in the landscape of an island on the northwestern edge of Europe, still asking, still speaking, still here, in the dark, as they have always been, as they will continue to be, for as long as there is someone to stand within them and look toward the light. This is the gift that Britain's ancient ruins give to everyone who encounters them. Not just historical knowledge or archaeological data or cultural heritage in the abstract sense, but the lived experience of being connected across the incomprehensible span of time to other human beings who were afraid and curious and driven and creative and who refused, in the end, to disappear without leaving something behind. The gift is the knowledge that you are not the first, that the questions you carry have been carried before, that the darkness you are sitting in right now is not unprecedented. It has been sat in before by people who did not know whether the sun would return and who built something pointing toward the east to mark the place where they believed it would. And the sun returned. it always returned. The monument was right. The builders were right to trust the pattern. And we can take a small, improbable, ancient comfort from the fact that they were right. The sun returns. The light enters the chamber. The stones are still standing. And we are still here, asking, wondering, building, in the dark, just like them. Just like the very first people who stood on this island and looked at the sky and felt the need to make something permanent in response to what they saw. The conversation continues. The ruins endure. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, you are part of it now. Part of the 30,000. Part of the long dark. Part of the patient waiting for the dawn. Sleep well. The stones will still be there in the morning. They always are. There is one more story this island tells, and it is perhaps the strangest one of all. It is the story of what happens when the ruins speak to people who were not looking for them, who were not on a pilgrimage or an archaeological dig or a solstice ceremony, but who simply happened to be in the landscape at the wrong time or the right time and found themselves inside something ancient that they had not been looking for. Britain is full of accidental archaeologists, farmers who turned up gold talks with their ploughs, railway engineers who drove their cuttings through Bronze Age burial sites and had to stop and call in the experts, water company workers digging trenches who found Roman mosaic floors, developers excavating foundations who revealed the wooden posts of Neolithic ceremonial enclosures. The ground in Britain gives up its secrets to anyone who digs, and the secrets are almost always older than expected and more complete than seems reasonable. There is a famous case from the Salisbury Plain, very close to Stonehenge, where a farmer ploughing a field in the 1960s noticed that his plough was behaving differently in one section of the field, catching and releasing in a rhythm that did not match the normal resistance of the soil. He stopped and investigated and found, just below the topsoil, a series of pits that, when excavated, revealed themselves to be a Bronze Age offering deposit, a collection of objects that had been deliberately placed in the ground sometime around 1500 BC and had been waiting there, undisturbed, for 3,500 years, until a plough happened to catch the edge of one of the pits and break the seal. The objects in the pits were not treasure in the conventional sense. No gold, no precious stones, mostly pottery vessels, some containing organic residues that may once have been food or drink, and animal bones, and fragments of metalwork, and a few small objects of carved bone or antler whose function is not clear. The deposit had been made and covered and forgotten, presumably by people who intended to come back to it, and who never did, or who made the deposit as a permanent offering with no intention of retrieval. And there it sat, through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Roman period and the medieval period and the agricultural revolution and the early 20th century, until a plough in the 1960s found it. 3,500 years of waiting, 3,500 years of being under the soil, patient, silent, unchanged, while history happened above. The pottery is still intact. The bone fragments are still identifiable. The offering is still an offering, in the sense that it can still be understood as one. The intention of the people who made it is still recoverable, even if their names and their language and their specific beliefs are not. This is what Britain's ground contains. Not just the large monuments that everybody knows about. The invisible majority. The thousands, the tens of thousands, perhaps the hundreds of thousands of deposits and features and traces that are still down there, still waiting, still patient, still completely unaware of everything that has happened above them since they were placed. The ground in Britain is an archive in the most literal sense. It contains the material record of 10,000 years of human activity, layer upon layer, most of it undisturbed, most of it perfectly preserved in the specific conditions that prevail in the chalk and clay and peat of this particular island. Every time someone digs in Britain, they are opening a page of that archive, and the archive is enormous. We have read a tiny fraction of it. We will spend many more centuries reading more. And some of it, the parts beneath cities, beneath motorways, beneath the accumulated infrastructure of modern civilization, we may never be able to read at all. The ruins are not only on the surface, they are under the surface. They are in the soil chemistry of fields that were farmed in the Neolithic period. They are in the isotope ratios of ancient bones that can tell us where the people lived and what they ate. They are in the pollen preserved in peat bogs that can reconstruct the vegetation of Britain 10,000 years ago with a precision that is genuinely astonishing. They are in the DNA extracted from the bones of people who died before any civilization that left written records had come to exist. Britain is an archive. The whole island is an archive, and the archive is still being written, even now, by the deposition of new layers on top of old ones, by the slow chemical processes that are transforming the objects placed in the ground today into the archaeological record of the future. The people who come after us will excavate our landfills and our infrastructure and our abandoned buildings with the same careful attention that we bring to the Neolithic monuments. They will analyze the chemistry of our soil and the isotopes of our bones and the genetics of our populations and the acoustic properties of our buildings. And they will try to understand what we were doing and why, and what we believed and what we feared and what we hoped for. And the ruins we leave them will speak for us, as the ruins of Britain's prehistoric peoples speak for them. Not completely, not without ambiguity, not in any language that can simply be translated, but in the way that stone and earth and the orientation of buildings toward the sun always speaks, in the way that the pattern of a culture's investments in permanence always tells you something real about what that culture valued and feared and believed. What will our ruins tell them? What will the pattern of our investments in permanence reveal? What did we build that was meant to last? What did we point toward the light, and what did we point away from it? What did we put in the ground, deliberately, as offerings, as archives, as arguments for our continued existence? And what did we put in the ground, carelessly, without thinking about permanence at all, trusting that the future would make sense of it? The ruins of Britain's ancient past ask these questions of the ruins of Britain's present, and the ruins of Britain's present do not yet have answers. The archive is still being made, the argument is still being written, the offering is still being placed in the ground, and somewhere, 3,500 years from now, a plough or a developer's machine or an archaeologist's trowel will break through the surface and find something that was left today, and the person who finds it will hold it in their hands and wonder what it meant to the people who made it, and whether they knew when they placed it in the ground that it would still be here so far in the future. They will wonder what we were asking. They will wonder whether we knew the answer. They will do what all people do when they hold something ancient in their hands. They will listen, and they will hear if they are very quiet and very patient. The same thing that every set of ruins in Britain has always said to anyone willing to stand inside them and let the silence work. We were here. We tried. We built. We believed something worth building toward. And now you are here, and the light is still coming. From the east. As it always has. As it always will. For as long as anyone is standing in the right place to receive it. Stand in the right place. Receive the light, and carry it forward, as the builders always did, as the monuments have always asked, as the long dark of this island's ancient past has always whispered, to anyone willing to listen in the quiet before the dawn. The conversation is not over. The ruins are not finished, and neither are you. Sleep now. The stones are keeping watch. They have been at it for a while. They know how. And in the morning, when the light comes, as it always does, the argument will continue. 30,000 voices, all saying the same thing, all still here, all still speaking, For you. And so we return to where we began, to the question that started this long walk through the ancient landscape of Britain. Why does this island have more ancient ruins than any country in Europe? We have been building an answer for a long time now, laying stone on stone, the way the builders themselves worked, each piece adding to the argument until the structure holds something larger than any single piece could carry. The dark reason is not a single reason. It is 30,000 reasons, each one a monument, each monument a decision made by people who understood, in the most visceral and urgent way, that existence is temporary and that the right response to that temporariness is to build something that will outlast the temporary. The geology conspired, the geography concentrated. The island's boundedness intensified competition and sustained traditions that might elsewhere have diffused and dispersed. The specific cultural logic of ancestor veneration and astronomical orientation took root here and lasted longer here than anywhere else in Europe. Each new wave of people inherited the monuments and added to them rather than erasing them. The landscape preserved what was built with unusual fidelity, and the accumulated result is 30,000 sites, 30,000 arguments, 30,000 moments of human determination encoded in stone and earth, and the precise orientation of a doorway toward a specific point on the horizon where the sun does something particular at a particular time of year. The dark reason is that these people knew they were going to die and they built against it anyway. The hopeful reason is the same. They were right. Their work lasted. Their argument is still being made. And now you know it too. Carry it with you, into whatever morning is waiting on the other side of this dark. The stones will be there when you wake. They always are. If this journey through Britain's ancient dark kept your mind wandering, while you drifted toward sleep, tap the like button. Subscribe so you do not miss the next exploration. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is. There are people in every time zone right now, listening to these same ancient stones, asking the same questions, all waiting for their own dawn.